Hey everyone, and welcome to Chef AJ Live. I'm your host, Chef AJ, and this is where I introduce you to amazing people like you who are doing great things in the world that I think you should know about. Today we have Dr. Peter Rogers, and he's going to talk about how to prevent disease. Please welcome him to the show. It's nice to meet you.
Hi.
Yeah, you actually reached out to me, which I really love because I'm not shy, but I don't like to ask people to be on the show because sometimes I don't like rejection. So how do you know who I am? A big fancy doctor.
Well, I've seen a lot of your shows. You got a lot of great shows. And I actually thought if the vegan community had a Mother's Day party, it would be at your house. Like the big mama of the vegan community. Everybody welcome like a family. You accept all the differences.
Thank you. That's very kind. And who is Dr. Peter Rogers? I know you now because I'm not kidding, spent yesterday. I watched every single one of your YouTubes on your 3 channels. So I know a little bit about you, but you might be unfamiliar with our guests. So how did you first discover a plant-based diet, when, and what made you adopt it? Other than the fact that obviously you're really smart.
Well, where I came from was when I was young, I was a very competitive athlete in high school. My junior year, I was like 39-1, third in the state, and I really hadn't been coached yet, so I knew I had tremendous potential to be a national champion. But I got injured, and I fractured my clavicle, and I kept refracturing it through the growth plate. And the significance of that was it ended up that the Big Ten schools like Iowa didn't want me anymore, but Stanford still offered me a scholarship. I did go on to become student athlete of the year at Stanford, and so I had a very sort of intense, competitive, academic, and athletic youth, if you will. And so in my 30s, I got really busy. I was doing a fellowship, trying to simultaneously really do 2 fellowships. I was doing a neuroradiology fellowship at that time, and I was also doing an interventional radiology, which is like imaging-guided endovascular brain surgery. And then I had a child at home. I wasn't getting any sleep, and I got fat. And I'm like, oh my God, how could this happen to me? This should never happen to me. I was a little bit freaked out by it, but I figured it's no big deal. I'll just exercise more and eat less, and I'll lose the weight real fast. I couldn't lose the weight for a couple years, and I was kind of very arrogant. I had scored like about the highest in the United States, 780 out of 800. That's 99.99 percentile in biochemistry, which included nutrition. So I thought I knew nutrition. And so anyways, about 4 years went by, and I was still fat, and I started to become scared. I'm going to become a fat diabetic, impotent, and have all these problems. I was scared. And one of my cousins teased me about it. They're like, if you know so much about nutrition, why are you so fat, Mr. Doctor? And what ended up happening was then I said, gee, I have to devote my life to understanding this, because if I don't, I'm going to be sick and it's not going to be good. Plus other things had happened in my life where I started to realize, even though I thought I had the best possible medical training in the entire world, I had perfect 99s on my boards in medical school and residency. But then I became scared because I said, my mom had gotten cancer and she had died. She died, about 11, 12 years after her diagnosis. They told her she's only going to live 2. So she did pretty good in that sense, made it to 12. But later on, I started to learn that, some of these cancer patients had really poor prognosis and they lived, for another 30 years. And I wondered, was I missing something? My father had some cardiac problems. I told him to go vegetarian based on my reading, but I didn't come down strong on it. He went for open heart surgery, and everything went well with the surgery. I slept in the room with him in the ICU post-op, and I couldn't believe how hypotensive he was post-op. They were running him about 85 over 60. And I said to the anesthesiologist, why are you running his pressure so low? And he says, well, we don't want him to bleed out through the anastomoses. But it's like, my dad was a pretty healthy guy, I think, compared to most open heart surgery patients, coronary artery bypass, grass cabbage. But still, that left an impression on me that if you run somebody hypotensive for a prolonged amount of time, you're potentially depriving their brain of blood flow, leading to chronic cerebral hypoperfusion, which could cause dementia, cognitive impairment. Well, anyways, what I'm sort of getting at was I thought I was such a great doctor. And then I said to myself, well, if I'm such a great doctor, why am I fat? Why is my dad going for heart surgery? Why my mom dying of cancer? I'm missing something. Or maybe medicine just doesn't know that much and you can't really help people that much. So anyways, the more I studied this vegan diet, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is the most powerful thing there is in all of medicine. I'm trained in very high-tech medicine. I've done tons of imaging guided surgery. I've trained at Harvard. I've also spent a long time at pretty fancy medical places. And I can tell you, in all of medicine, in all of health, the most powerful thing is the vegan diet. And you will say, well, why is that? And the reason is that's how we're sort of designed to work. That's how our metabolism works. And the more I started reading about it, the more clear that was. So that kind of is what happened, because I always wanted to be a great doctor. And it was sort of like, don't get me wrong, I really like high-tech medicine, and it does help patients, and it does solve a lot of complex problems. But for the general average person, this vegan diet is the most powerful thing. I got my coat's like hanging over my chair.
What I like about when I watched your videos about what the healthiest diet is, it wasn't just a vegan diet or a whole food plant-based diet. It was similar to my diet. It was low in fat, high in starch, without sugar, oil, and salt. You seem to eat the same way I do.
Yeah, because the more I studied it, the more it became clear that was the best way to go. And it's sort of like one way I would describe like what has sort of shaped my thinking. First of all, you have to read, watch videos. That's how you educate yourself. But what also happens then is it's very valuable to look at epidemiology. It becomes totally obvious. In the American population, the vast majority of persons over 50, they're fat, they're sick, they got a lot of medical problems. Many of them are cognitively impaired. But then you go look at these rural populations still eating plant-based, like the Yanomamo in South America. They don't add any salt. About 200 milligrams a day is their sodium intake. They have zero hypertension. And that was repeated over and over. The rural Kenyans, essentially zero hypertension. And in multiple populations, they have no coronary artery disease. Look at the Tarahumara. You know, you got 50-year-old guy running 200 miles in 2 days. And then demographically matched population, the Pima in Arizona eating the SAD diet, tremendous obesity, gallstones, diabetes. So what I'm saying is it's so obvious. It's not even like 5 to 4. It's 100 to 0. Okay, the difference between the health of the population is eating the plant-based diet versus the ones eating the SAD diet.
Yeah, I don't know if you can see our chat, but did people tell you you look like someone?
I don't know.
Dr. Michael Greger?
Maybe a little bit. Maybe a little bit.
Like you could be his brother, maybe. Anyway, that's great. So you're what type of medicine do you practice?
Well, I did an internship in surgery. Then I did a diagnostic radiology residency. So I'm board certified in diagnostic radiology. Then I did a fellowship at Harvard in interventional radiology with the emphasis on vascular disease. And then later on, and I'm board certified, got board certified in that. Then I went and did a fellowship in neuroradiology. And I considered being a neurointerventionalist, which is an imaging guided, endovascular brain surgeon. But it turns out that's been taken over by neurosurgery. So I just stuck with the neuroradiology, which means reading a lot of brain MRIs. And that ended up turning out very interesting because I've seen thousands of brain MRIs with the history, Alzheimer's, memory loss, cognitive impairment. And I got some interesting slides and some things to say about that because I think that the entire thought process on cognitive impairment and dementia is wrong. And the much better way to look at it is from the point of view of vascular disease. And the reason that's such a big thing is that empowers the individual because you can prevent vascular disease. Nobody fully understands beta amyloid and the cascade hypothesis. Wow.
Are you able to work, but in the type of field of medicine you're doing, you don't really see your patients, right? Or don't see them often.
Yeah, I talk to patients when I do biopsies, and I also, I interact a lot with friends and acquaintances and things like that. But I'm not like a clinical doctor who sees, like an internal medicine doctor who sees patients in a clinic or something. No, I'm pretty specialized. I'm kind of like a doctor's doctor, really. I'm like, that's kind of like, what am I known for? Solving very complex brain problems. Guys with 50 years experience will come to me to ask them how to figure out a brain problem. That's a pretty common thing that I do.
Right. So do you ever get a chance to talk to patients about their lifestyle?
I do a little bit, and I would love to. I would love to do this health, nutrition type stuff, but there's no money in it. I do high tech. I like high tech. I get paid to do high tech. I just do this nutrition stuff because it's such a great thing. It's just a hobby for me. And I'll tell you a story too about my background because it might explain like where I'm coming from. When I was in college as a freshman at Stanford, I was very frustrated. I had gone there because the Schultz brothers were the coaches. Schultz brothers were national champions, world champions, Olympic champion wrestlers. They're from California, from Palo Alto, Mark and Dave Schultz, okay? They went to college at Oklahoma, but they got recruited as coaches at Stanford, and that's also what got me to go over there. But anyways, I was kind of scared of them. I was a little freshman. I had re-injured my shoulder. I got like 2 B's and 2 B minuses or something, my first set of grades. I was totally lonely. I didn't know anyone there. And so the reason I'm telling you all this is I called my mom. I said, Ma, I don't want to be here. I want to go back to Illinois. And it was sort of a difficult time for me, right? But the reason I tell you all this is my mom said, Peter, God doesn't want you to be a wrestler. He wants you to be a doctor. And see, I loved wrestling because when you're an athlete, you're like a celebrity. Everybody wants to be your friend and it's lots of fun. Okay. So I didn't know what else to do. And then when I got injured as an athlete, if you suddenly get injured and you lose your ability to perform, it's kind of like you lost your identity. It's like, who am I if I'm not an athlete? I mean, all my friends were athletes. Everybody I know, everybody I hung around with was a wrestler or related to wrestler or something. So what I'm trying to say was, my mother said to me, God doesn't want you to be a wrestler. He wants you to be a doctor or a scientist. I think you're going to be a great doctor or scientist, and I don't want you to transfer out. I want you to just stick out 1 year, do the best you can, and if you don't like it, you can come home. And she says, someday you're going to be a great doctor or scientist. I said, okay, Mom, you know what? I'll go with that. I'll give it a try, Mom. And the relevance being that was a tremendously good thing for me. There's 2 things I would suggest related to this from a psychology point of view. Dombrowski is the name of a Polish psychologist who described what is called the theory of personality disintegration and reintegration. Basically, when you lose something from your identity, your life, you can sometimes compensate for it by putting extra effort into another area. And that was very important to me. It's very popular with the gifted community and gifted students, this concept of Dombrowski theory of personality disintegration, reintegration. Subsequent to that was I had read and heard about the Alfred Adler concept of the inferiority principle. So because I had repeatedly been re-injured, I was mad at myself. I was like, you ruined your own life. You're a stupid idiot. And I wasn't able to forgive myself. So I was mad at myself for getting re-injured. And that was kind of a big deal because it was hard for me to be happy when I was always sort of mad at myself, knowing that I went from being great athlete to kind of just being okay. So what I'm trying to say here is once I realized I could recreate a new identity as a great scholar, scientist, maybe future doctor, I was so happy for this opportunity that it gave me incredible energy. After that, I became an incredible student. I got A+ in organic chemistry, A+ in biology, first in my medical school class. I was so happy to have a chance at a new thing that might make me happy or give me, sort of a view of the world. I don't know how to explain it, but it's like I lost my life as an athlete and I regained it as a doctor scientist. But that's why I think like a lot of people got real high IQs, they're real smart, they can learn something fast, but they don't have that much intellectual curiosity. There's no money in this nutrition stuff. There's no money in sitting here cranking through all these books. I crank through tons and tons of books, okay? I just like it. And I like it. I see it as my job in a sense, my destiny, that I'm supposed to be well-informed on all this stuff. So that's kind of how I transformed myself into this scholar. I wasn't just trying to get a good grade in biology. I wanted to become a biologist. I was out in the woods with the kids that were interested in that, and all the A+ students, a big difference between them and the kids that were just doing okay was they really wanted to learn the subject, not just to memorize for a test. And we would talk about biology. We'd be out in the woods talking about theories. We'd be bird watching. We loved being out in the woods, and we considered ourselves potentially future biologists, Anyways.
Wow. Well, since you don't really have the kind of relationship with patients that traditional doctors do, are you able to influence any of your MD colleagues to eat up?
I try, and I do have some successes. For example, I just got one of my doctor buddies, fellow neuroradiologist, called me, and his wife was in kidney failure. She had dropped her glomerular filtration rate to 15 after, reading my books. She got her GFR up to 45, which is good. She's not going to have to go on dialysis. She's got diabetes. So I get a lot of individual conversations. And I know there's a lot of people, anybody that cares about their health and has begun to think about it, it becomes pretty obvious that nutrition is very valuable to learn about. So a lot of people just come to me on a personal basis, friendship basis. And I do talk to other people sort of randomly, but I've noticed most people, they really don't get it. They don't have intellectual curiosity. They've sort of convinced themselves, they've given up on themselves. They've tried a bunch of diets, they're fat, they're sick, and they just sort of accept that as their fate. But the reality is they could do a lot better if they would sort of wake up and see things in a different way with regard to nutrition.
Great. I see a question in the chat from a live viewer. Let's see, it moved. It was about if something, I think it was about MS, if it could be reversed and if ataxia could be reversed. Do you know anything about that?
About multiple sclerosis?
Yeah. If it could,
well, multiple sclerosis, of course, typically it's thought to be primarily periventricular demyelination. Okay. And there is a paper suggesting that there's overlap with butyrophilin, milk protein. And then, of course, Dr. McDougall did great work with his friend, Dr. Swank. And Dr. Swank was a neurologist originally out in Canada, and he had noticed in the Norway populations, in the dairy consuming areas, there was much higher multiple sclerosis. So Dr. Swank put his patients on a low-fat diet. I think it was about 15% fat. And he had follow-up with a paper written at 34 years where his patients had about 95% maintenance of ability to function in activities of daily living, which is incredibly higher than the typical MS statistics. And I've come to believe from a lot of reading and studying that I think leaky gut plays a major effect. And I'm going to talk some more about fat, but fat is a strange thing. If you think about a typical fatty acid, it's a carboxylic acid, meaning that it's got one end is polar with the carboxylic acid, and then it's got this long fatty acid chain tail. So something that has a polar component, a strong polar component, and a non-polar component is called amphiphilic, like an amphibian, can live on land and water. And what that means is it can be soluble in both an aqueous solution and in a lipid solution. And the point being is it could function as an emulsifier. An emulsifier is something that can pull something from the lipid solution into aqueous solution. And the reason I'm going through all that is from my study, I haven't figured it all out yet, but my impression from reading about all these fatty acids is they can function almost like a detergent. They can disrupt plasma membranes and increase leaky gut. And they're damaging. I think along the lines of like what Pritikin said. Nathan Pritikin was a genius. He basically said, fat is bad. The more I study fat, the more I want to minimize my percent intake of fat. And I don't even think there's any such thing as good fats. I think all dietary fats are essentially bad. And there's something tricky and something cool about fat. Here it is. When you eat fiber, the good gut bacteria convert that fiber into short-chain fatty acids. And so there's, first they make acetate, that's got 2 carbons. Then they make propionate, it's got 3 carbons. Then they make butyrate, it's got 4 carbons. They especially make acetate, 2-carbon unit. Think about it, that's like acetyl-CoA. And here's what I'm getting at. The colonocytes absorb these short-chain fatty acids, and then they travel through the portal vein, and they go to the liver, and the liver can use them to build larger fatty acids if it feels that's necessary. You can take the 2-carbon units and make even number of carbon fatty acid, which is the most common in the human body, but you can take the propionates, 3 carbon, and make an odd number of carbon fatty acid, okay? The reason I'm going through this is what I'm saying is you get some dietary lipid from fiber, but it comes totally safe. It's increasing your gut wall function because about 70% of the energy use is in your colonocytes. Colonocyte just means, site means cell, colon is colon, colonocyte are the lining cells of the colon. The gut's also called the enteric tract, so you'll often hear the lining cells called enterocytes. And what I'm saying is the butyrate is used by the colonocytes to maintain their tight junctions and to prevent leaky gut. So fiber is double beneficial in this sense. It's helping to prevent leaky gut while simultaneously providing the body with adequate lipid. And I think this is one of the secrets of why a person can live off of potatoes, for example, with only like less than 1% fat, because they're also getting some lipid from the fiber. So it's sort of a wonderful deal. You don't need all the bile salts to absorb them. So you lower your risk of colon cancer, you get the lipid you need, you protect your gut from leaky gut, increased intestinal permeability. Okay, and so why do I go through all this? It's thought that the mechanism of most autoimmune disease is so-called leaky gut, whereby you'll have increased permeability of the intestinal lining, and then a relatively large protein segment can be absorbed. Normally, nothing bigger than a tripeptide, 3 amino acids, would be absorbed across that intestinal lining. But when there's increased intestinal permeability, you can get a bigger chunk of protein. Now, if it's coming from an animal, it'll often have many amino acid sequences that overlap with the sequences in the human body. That's thought to be the mechanism of type 1 diabetes. Again, dairy-related proteins, and it could be more than dairy-related proteins with MS, but certainly dairy-related proteins are thought to be one of the main actors in the causation of multiple sclerosis. Okay, so what happens is you form antibodies to that large amino acid chunk there, a little piece of protein, and then they can cross-react with proteins in the human body like the myelin basic protein. So that's called molecular mimicry in the sense that they have similar amino acid sequences, and then because the antibody then reacts against itself, that's called autoantibody or antibody cross-reactivity. And that's thought to be the number one mechanism of leaky gut. The only thing I would say about leaky gut is there's many causes of leaky gut in addition to saturated fat. For example, in processed food, the emulsifiers are also amphiphilic, being both polar and nonpolar and able to merge lipid and aqueous solutions and chemicals. So emulsifiers in processed food, big potential contributor to leaky gut. And there's actually many other things. The chlorine in water contributes to, can injure a lot of your good gut bacteria, and that can lead to more bad gut bacteria. And that sequence of events can contribute to leaky gut. And there's a whole bunch of other things. So one of the things I'm a big believer in, and why am I so meticulous about trying to eat healthy? I'm about 58 years old, by the way. I don't have any medical problems. My total cholesterol is 93. My LDL is 53. My triglycerides are 85. I tell you that. My BMI, I don't even know what it is, but I know it's low. So I just share that with you because if a person's eaten meat for a couple of decades, you have a lot of internal damage to your organ systems, and basically you want to protect them. Okay, there's people in Okinawa and some of these other blue zones and whatnot. They're in their hundreds and they have no medical problems. We are capable potentially of being over 100 years of age and physically fit and active and energetic and mentally sharp. But so what I'm trying to say is I'm not seeking to be okay with my health. I want to be as good as possible. My goal is not to just be less fat than my cousin. My goal is the best possible health. And because I believe, I want to stay mentally sharp. And, who knows what type of problems I caused for myself when I was younger from eating meat and being kind of careless.
It's very controversial with fat because I haven't eaten any fat. There's fat in the food, obviously, but no overt fat in 10 years. And people say you're killing people and, we need fat. We're going to have a dementia or a heart attack or stroke if we don't eat nuts every day. You get that a lot.
I don't believe it. I think the work of Caldwell Esselstyn is quite extraordinary. He recommends his patients don't eat any nuts. Nuts are very high in fat. Now, I think if you're pretty meticulous about your diet and you have a real low cholesterol, to have nuts on occasion, once every couple of months, I think that's fine. But it's also the case that it's very hard for people to titrate their response. And like all Caldwell Esselstyn had said, I actually, by the way, went and trained with him too. I like him. I think he's fantastic. He said that if he told his patient a little nuts are okay, he's afraid his patients would be eating them every day and binging on them. They're about, 70 to 90% fat. That's a lot of fat. And, all fat is bad for blood flow. That's been shown through Vogel's brachial artery reactivity test, that it impairs the ability of the brachial artery to vasodilate. And there's multiple papers on it. I'm going to go into it on one of my slides, but you can't win with fat. You really can't. I think fat is bad. It's bad for blood flow. It's bad for your gut. It also is potentially bad for your blood-brain barrier. And, I worry about rouleau-induced hypoxia, whereby there's a tendency, think about when you're cooking, how oil gets all over the place. It's hard to rinse off of anything. If you look at scientists, they've had problems doing research with lipids, that it sticks to all the plastics and other things. So what I'm trying to say is there is real reason to be concerned about the effects of high dietary lipids impairing your blood flow, impairing the oxygen supply to your brain. And I think it's wise to kind of keep lipids to a relative minimum.
Great, thanks. So we won't drop dead if we're not pounding down the nuts and seeds every day. People worry about those omega-3 fatty acids.
Yeah, I know omega-3 fatty acids. There's problems with omega-3 fatty acids. There's, been multiple papers suggesting an increased association with prostate carcinoma. And then there's additional studies about concerns for immune suppression. Plus, if you think about an omega-3 fat, its purpose is basically to be like biological antifreeze in a fish that lives at 32 to 33 degrees temperature. And what I'm getting at is, you look at those long chain omega-3 fatty acids, DHA and EPA, they've got numerous double bonds, and there'll be a carbon in between those double bonds called the methylene bridge. And the point of that carbon is it has a very weak hold on its hydrogen. That hydrogen gets plucked off pretty easy, and then it'll undergo a reaction in the presence of oxygen to form reactive oxygen species. That's called lipid peroxidation. And what I'm saying is that happens spontaneously at room temperature. That's why they tell you store those omega-3s in a refrigerator. They got a radio opaque bottle on it because they're so afraid of how quickly it can go rancid. And so what I'm saying is, it'll go rancid in room temperature pretty quickly. You know, in your body, a higher temperature, they have a pretty concerning risk of lipid peroxidation. Lipid peroxidation can be quite damaging. And again, I don't have every single sequence of the biochemical reactions memorized here, but I worry about injury to the internal mitochondrial membrane, which has an especially vulnerable type of lipid called cardiolipin. Cardiolipin lipid peroxidation is a common cause of mitochondrial injury, and I worry. Now, I haven't figured that all out, so I'm not going to say any more about it, but all I'm saying is, from what I've read, I think you get enough lipid just from eating plant foods, and you sort of get the source lipids. You get linolenic acid and alpha-linolenic acid, ALA, and then your body's able to convert as much as it needs, has been my impression from reading about it. So I at this time, I do not recommend taking omega-3s.
So Faith is asking, but no flax, no chia every day?
No, I don't recommend that stuff. There's a lot of fat. I don't know much about chia, but I know flax has got lots of fat in it. I worry about lipid peroxidation. Plus, it's got tons of estrogen in it. Flax and soy have literally thousands of times more estrogen than other foods. So I think one has to be careful with that. I'm actually going to talk a little bit about estrogens today. If you think about it, in a woman's body, she typically has about 20 to 400 nanograms. I forget if it's over milliliters. I forget the second part of the unit. But in men, it's typically about 20 nanograms. Here's my point. You can get thousands of nanograms of these external estrogens from diet and transdermal exposures. And I think that those are dangerous. They're increasing women's risk of breast cancer. And also, you know, when you have very high estrogens, it sort of tells your body that you're pregnant. And when it tells your body that you're pregnant, it sort of activates something called the PPAR gamma switch. And it causes a woman's body to try to gain weight to save it in case the baby needs it for energy. It sort of switches. Sometimes that's been called the fat switch or the hunger switch. And when a person becomes more fat, then the more of that fat tissue is making more estrogens. So it predisposes her to obesity, to diabetes, increases her risk of autoimmune disease. You think about having a baby is like having a transplant, okay? A woman's immune system has to be able to tolerate that baby. So what I'm saying is, I think the risk of estrogens, endogenous estrogens, is very under-recognized. I'm actually going to talk about it. There's a lot of them. They're in the water. They're in cosmetics. They're in detergents. They're in soaps. They're in shampoos. They're in deodorants. And they're easy to avoid if you understand them, but most people don't. And I think that greatly increases the risk of breast cancer.
Great. Did you want to start your slides now or take some questions? Or
okay. Well, I mean, if you got a question you want me to take, I'll take it, or I can show the slides.
Either way, there was a question if there's a link between pulmonary fibrosis and diet.
A link between pulmonary fibrosis and diet. Off the top of my head, I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if there is, but off the top of my head, I don't know.
Great.
Okay. Oh, I got to share.
Yeah, people keep asking about their favorite fat. What about avocado? What about walnuts? What about tahini? You know?
Yeah, I'll also talk. So I shared, let's see. Can you see it?
Yes, you just need to put it in presenter mode when you get a chance.
Okay. Okay, so this is one thing I'm going to talk about too. Actually, I think that's on my first slide I start talking about. Okay, that was what I thought for you, Chef AJ. And then here, let me move this thing out over to the corner. It's good to have what I consider a good philosophic attitude or view of health and aging, successful aging, because some people say, well, why are you talking about philosophy? All I care about is the science. And what I'm trying to say is to some extent, they partially go together. And what I mean by that is, in my experience, first of all, I'll go through this and then I'll get to the philosophy. Most people do not age well. I see tons and tons of cognitive impairment. It's very sad. And diabetics in particular have tremendously high levels of cognitive impairment. So many people are functioning way below their potential abilities. And like I said, too, I wanted to, let me see if I can go back a slide previous. Okay. So if you learn the vegan diet, that'll help you with a lot of your health problems, cure your obesity. If you read, that'll cure your ignorance, or watching videos. You can learn a tremendous amount watching these internet videos. And learn epidemiology, tremendously motivating. I mean, when you look at epidemiology, it's like 100 to 0. The vegans have 0 hypertension, 0 coronary artery disease, much lower incidence of cancer. For example, basically pretty much anybody that eats meat after 50 years of age and eats a lot of, processed food or oils and junk food, they almost always end up getting surgery, open heart surgery, prostate surgery, breast surgery, you name it, diabetes, toe amputations. I see tons and tons of patients going for surgery, all because of this atherosclerosis, metabolic syndrome stuff. So eating meat and processed food is like saying you want surgery. And what am I getting at? The attitude and philosophy, I think, that help optimize your aging is to have what I would call an attitude of gratitude. Basically, if you just go into old age saying, I hope everything turns out well, and you keep eating meat and processed food and oil and stuff, you're probably going to be fat, hypertensive, diabetic, and end up going blind and needing a bunch of surgeries. Tons of vision problems. And we're going to talk about vision in a little while, because I can tell you, I've looked at thousands of brains, and almost every single one of these patients with impaired cognitive function, they've got some type of eye problem, cataract, glaucoma, diabetic retinopathy, hypertensive retinopathy, aging-related macular degeneration. So what I'm saying is you can see the retina quite well in ophthalmologists. They can, and the retina is part of the brain. So the eye is not just a window to the soul. The eye is a window to the brain. And when the person's having a problem with their eyes like that, that's an indicator that cognitive impairment, Alzheimer's, dementia, vascular dementia, there's a good chance it's not far behind. So what I'm recommending in terms of an attitude of gratitude, you say to yourself, all I have to do is eat these plant foods and my arteries will stay open and I won't have to go for surgery, and I probably will never get diabetes, high blood pressure, a stroke, a myocardial infarction. This is great. This is great. Thank you. I'm so happy. This is wonderful. I'll do it. I'll do it. That is what I would describe as a proper AA attitude towards aging and vegan diet. It's a chance to live longer, to live healthier, to be able to enjoy your life, to maintain your cognitive function, rather than being fat and sick like so many people. I see so many people just crash and burn, tons of them. Anywhere you go, as soon as the hospital door opens in the morning, it's like a river of diabetics, hypertensive, cardiac patients, stroke patients, and all these, sad things. Okay, I'm going to say one thing about thinking ability. Almost everybody's got a decent enough brain they can understand these things. It's not that complicated. Eat plants. But a lot of people, they all think they know food already. They know nutrition. They've been eating all their life, and it's kind of a big joke. So they don't have any curiosity. Or sometimes they take everything personal. Are you calling me fat or whatever? And what I'm trying to say is you have to be willing to learn. You have to be willing to say, well, I screwed up. I got fat from eating the wrong food, but maybe I can learn to make things better. And in my experience, most people actually aren't willing to do that, as simple as it sounds, but they never get better. The word chronic disease means never get better. When somebody says this person's hypertensive and this person has hyperlipidemia, that means every day the rest of their life they have to take medication for it, because they never get better. They progressively decline. The medicines slow it down a little bit, but the great thing about the vegan diet is the vegan diet slows it tremendously. I don't take any medicines, not a single one. Okay, so that was kind of my point on that one. Other things that correlate, these things with a good long life are having good social skills, getting along with people, helping people, walking more, having a sense of purpose in life makes you more resilient. Let's see. Okay, and then I was going to talk a little bit about what's the difference between meat and junk food. I look at meat and junk food as the same thing, kind of. I mean, they're not exactly, of course, but close enough. And then plant food being separate. This is important because a lot of people think, well, beef might be bad, but I eat fish or chicken. Nah, they're terrible food. All meat is bad. All meat is bad, and you shouldn't eat any, not one bite. Okay, why do I say that? Meat is basically fat, especially saturated fat, and it's also animal protein. And very often it is preserved in or flavored with sodium, extra salt. Okay, meat's deficient in things that are good. And there's two types of gut bacteria. There's the good bacteria that come from plants, and there's bad bacteria that come from meat. And that becomes relevant because gut health is important. Okay, junk food has emulsifiers, like we said, like saturated fat can disrupt intestinal permeability. A plant is primarily carbohydrate and fiber. And those are the good things, okay? Plants are also high in potassium, vasodilator, magnesium, vasodilator. They open your arteries. The reason people die is because their arteries are plugged up, especially in the brain and in the heart. And by the way, I'm a world-class expert in atherosclerosis. I can tell you atherosclerosis is a blood clot, okay? Cholesterol causes blood to clot, but it is a blood clot, okay? So you don't want things that cause your blood to clot unnecessarily. And plant leads to good gut bacteria. Fat is basically a poison. That's the way to think of it. I don't believe in this good fat stuff. I don't think there's any fats that are good for the human other than the small amount they get from eating healthy plant foods like potatoes, sweet potatoes, rice, beans, things like that. I think oatmeal's okay. It's a little bit on the high side of fat compared to the other starches, but it's okay. All right. What are some things about fat? Why do I say fat is a poison? Because number one, it increases leaky gut. So that predisposes you to generalized systemic inflammation, joint pain, and also to increase risk of some, pretty serious diseases like we spoke about multiple sclerosis earlier. Number two, fat increases what is called rouleau formation, whereby it sticks the red blood cells together. If you've got two red blood cells, imagine, let me see if I can get the right, I don't know if I got two. I got two orange highlighters. That's close enough. Imagine these are two red blood cells, okay? They've got something around them called a zeta potential, whereby their glycocalyx of sialic acids has a negative charge on it, and it repels the adjacent, I don't know if I can get them in the picture, it repels the adjacent red blood cell. They know this because you have to be able to store blood to give transfusions, okay? So what am I saying? LDL cholesterol is a bridging molecule. So yellow is a good color for lipids. LDL comes in there, and it'll stick the two RBCs together. If you type it into your internet browser, type in RBC zeta potential, and you'll see a picture come up of negative charges around an RBC. And then type in rouleau formation, okay? And you'll see RBC rouleau, for example, or RBC zeta potential. You'll see that an IgM antibody can also stick these things together. So when people have infections, there's increased IgM antibodies in the acute phase. It'll stick the red blood cells together, predispose them to clotting. You'll see all kinds of weird thromboses and increased myocardial infarctions with an acute severe infection. The LDL cholesterol also, it overcomes the zeta potential. It is the right size and the right charge to overcome the zeta potential of the red blood cells and stick them together. Okay, that's what a rouleau formation is. Uric acid can also be a bridging molecule. Fibrinogen can be a bridging molecule. Fibrinogen is a big one. It's increased with psychological stress and all the psychological stress equivalents. So you don't want that, okay? You don't want increased abnormal clotting, because when you plug up your blood vessels, you'll lose the tissue that doesn't get enough blood supply. Ischemia is decreased blood supply, and infarction is complete loss of blood supply with death of the tissue. Okay, so, and there were some great papers, a lot of great papers were written in the 1950s and 60s, and that's before the days of all this corporate interest, okay? They were just trying to figure out how does stuff work. And what they found out was if you feed a person a high-fat meal, their peak in lipidemia is typically about 5 hours after eating. Postprandial is the medical word for that. And there was even a guy by the name of Peter Quo who took a bunch of coronary artery angina patients. And this was before the days of IRB and internal review boards about research studies. And he fed them high-fat meals, and they would routinely get angina at about between 4 to 6 hours. Okay, and then he simultaneously checked their lipids every 30 minutes. And that was peak lipemia was at 5 hours. So that's been repeatedly shown. And he also showed that there are O2 sat would drop from about 96 to 92%, which correlates with a 15 to 20% drop in their partial pressure oxygen. And you would say, well, why weren't they sicker? Why aren't more people sicker after eating a high-fat meal? And the reason is, if you look at the hemoglobin oxygen dissociation curve, it's relatively flat at the top. So somebody who has less reserve, like a real sick pulmonary patient, might be more likely to become symptomatic after it. But you're dropping the oxygen supply to your cells. And again, I worry about that in the brain, because if you drop the oxygen supply to your brain cells while you simultaneously overstimulate them with stimulants like tobacco, caffeine, lack of sleep, psychological stress, MSG. You see what's happening here? This, I think, is a common cause of brain damage, that the metabolic rate of the neuron, I'm trying to keep my hands in the picture. The metabolic rate of the neuron is dramatically increased, while simultaneously, due to the high-fat meal causing rouleau hypoxia, the oxygen supply is dropped. So the neuron is screwed. Do you get it? Metabolic rate high, oxygen delivery, glucose delivery low. That neuron if this becomes chronic and severe, it will not be able to survive. A slow death of a neuron is called apoptosis, whereby it recycles itself. That's also called programmed cell death. And so what I'm saying is, people who do this every day, they're constantly losing neurons. And I look at lots of brain MRIs. The main thing I do is neuroradiologist. And the main thing I see on a brain MRI is generalized atrophy, diffuse, symmetric. I don't see this focal pattern of just medial temporal lobe atrophy. I think that that's totally exaggerated. The most common thing I see is diffuse cerebral atrophy. Second most common thing I see is periventricular flare hyperintensities, which is just a fancy way of saying we see what we believe is ischemic vascular disease in the deep white matter, centrally in the brain, okay? But I can tell you, very often, more often than not, you cannot explain from the visible periventricular stuff. It's only the atrophy. And that's why I think atrophy of cerebral cortex is the most common cause of dementia. And I'm going to get into some other theories of that, but fat is a major contributor to that. Also, fat increases your risk of cancer. When you make tissues hypoxia, if you read about cancer, you'll see two main theories, genetic theory of cancer and metabolic theory of cancer. And if you look at the work of Otto Warburg, he won the Nobel Prize back around 1930. And the gist of it was a normal cell in the human body prefers to function with oxygen. It can make about 18 times more energy through electron transport in the mitochondria in that fashion. But when it is deprived of oxygen, very often the cell will die, as I just spoke about, going to apoptosis. But some cells will not die. They will not go into apoptosis. What they do instead is they de-differentiate. Normally, a cell is part of an organ system, like this is a liver cell, this is a kidney cell, and then it has a job to do what liver cells do, to do what kidney cells do. But when deprived of oxygen, a cell will revert back to a primitive form of itself. This is called to de-differentiate. You'll hear that word all the time when you read about cancer. A de-differentiated cell whereby it says, screw it, I'm starving, I don't got any oxygen, my only chance at survival is I'm going to start behaving like a bacteria. And what a bacteria does is it only multiplies for the sake of itself, and it can run on anaerobic metabolism. So what I'm saying is deprivation of oxygen, hypoxia, being the medical world, can transform a cell, de-differentiate it into becoming cancer, okay? And it'll increase the risk of a cancer cell proliferating to its own advantage over the normal adjacent cells. The normal adjacent cells, they're like good team players. We are part of the liver. We got to make a good liver. Let's all work together. The cancer cells, screw it. I don't got enough oxygen. I'm just going to multiply anaerobically. I don't care what you guys do. All right. So in addition, when you have hypoxia, you increase something called hypoxia-inducible factor, HIF. And that's, like I said, changes the enzymes. It's like a transcription factor on the cell to go anaerobic. And it also increases something called VEGF, vascular endothelial growth factor, which will stimulate the growth of new capillaries. And those could be the path to metastases for developing cancer. So fat increases cancer risk. If you look at the charts, for example, in the T. Colin Campbell books, you'll see the more fat a person eats, the higher their cancer rate. And there's actually additional reasons for that. We'll get into them a little bit. We talked about fat increasing the risk of dementia because it causes hypoxia to brain cells. In addition, the saturated fats, they get incorporated into the plasma cell membrane. Saturated fats, they interdigitate. So they're stiff. They stiffen the plasma membrane and RBCs, making them less deformable. Typical RBC is just a little bit bigger than a capillary. Let's say about 7 microns, capillary diameter about 5 microns. So the RBC has to deform to get through that capillary. And the stiffer it is, the harder it is to get through there. The more all the red blood cells are stuck together because they're in rouleau, the harder it is for them to get through that capillary because they're all bunched together. Dr. McDougall has a beautiful video. If you just type in high fat meal or blood sludge, him and Roy Swank looked at the inner cheek pouches of hamsters, and they showed the red blood cells all sticking together, and that would plug up these small arterioles. In real time, you could see it. And if you look at the paper by, I think it's Meyer Friedman and Ray Rosenman, like I think it's like 1963 Journal of Circulation, something like that. And they put an 80 times microscope right on a person's eye, and then they fed them a high-fat meal, and they could see the small arterioles closing down in real time. Now, most of those reopen, of course, because otherwise the person would be blind real fast, which they're not. But they still lose some, and that process ongoing over and over is bad. That paper, there was actually a confounding variable in the sense that they fed them a high-fat meal, but they also fed them like bacon, which is typically highly salted, and sodium is a major vasoconstrictor, so that was contributing to it. But anyways, what I'm basically saying is fat decreases oxygen delivery, blood supply to tissue, and that's not good. In addition, the brain in particular likes to burn glucose. It takes a lot more energy to burn fat and beta oxidation than it does to burn glucose. And the beta oxidation is slower than is burning glucose for the brain cells. What else? It can potentially increase blood-brain barrier permeability when it impairs mitochondrial function. Here's something cool about diabetes. A lot of you know now, like most people think diabetes is a carbohydrate disease. Of course, Chef AJ's audience is more well-informed than that diabetes is primarily a lipid disease. And somehow the lipid gets into the skeletal muscle cells faster than does the glucose. And once it's in there, excessive amount of fats, in particular saturated fats. I'll give you the reference. It's a great paper. I got it right here on the slide by Michael Brownlee, the Banting Lecture of 2004. That's the best diabetes paper I've ever read in my life. I've read a lot of them. There's a lot of good ones, but I mean, it's incredible papers. It's not just a brilliant paper. It's a genius paper. It's an incredible paper. Michael Brownlee, Banting Lecture 2004, Pathobiology of Diabetes Complications, a unifying mechanism. Okay, so what am I saying is happening here? In particular, sat fat, but I think it's fat in general, leads to increased FADH2 electron carriers going to the inner mitochondrial membrane, and they overwhelm the mitochondrial membrane with these electron carriers. Too many electrons happening too quickly to be transported. And there's a very high grading in the inner mitochondrial membrane. It's about like negative 160 millivolts. And the point is, it becomes overwhelmed in the presence of excessive dietary fat. So the electron transport, it goes backwards. And that's not good, because when it goes backwards, then everything goes backwards. It's like having a traffic jam. It backs up Krebs cycle, also called tricarboxylic acid cycle, and it backs up glycolysis. Once it backs up glycolysis, in particular, 3-phosphoglyceraldehyde starts going off into these side pathways, including a pathway to inhibit protein kinase C, which is then going to block the glucose type 4 transporters from going up to the plasma cell membrane. And you need those glucose type 4 transporters to bring glucose into the skeletal muscle cell. Normally, you want about 80-85% of your postprandial glucose going into the skeletal muscle cell. When the glucose can't get into the skeletal muscle cell, it stays in the blood. That's what causes hyperglycemia. Sort of like a definition of diabetes is fasting blood glucose greater than 126. And anyways, the point I'm making is that once you've got that high blood glucose, it causes problems because it's not supposed to be there. There's other cells that cannot turn themselves off. Like you look at an endothelial cell, you look at a retinal cell, you look at a kidney cell, they're always on. And so when hyperglycemia is present, they take in too much glucose. And that excessive uptake of glucose, because it's not insulin dependent, their uptake of glucose, causes those cells to injure their mitochondria and overload their mitochondria. And then you get mitochondrial dysfunction with a backup of electron transport, a backup Krebs cycle, and a backup of glycolysis. So what am I saying? What I'm saying is metabolism is injured, not just in skeletal muscle, it's injured throughout the body. So these are additional reasons why I don't like dietary fats. And then what about omega-3 PUFAs? I recommend avoiding them because of lipid peroxidation. So I don't know, but we can talk about that more later if there's interest. You know what else is great? If you really are curious about diabetes, you can check out the Banting Lecture of 2018 by Gerald Shulman. That's online. That's available. It's really good. Shulman's he's like another genius. He's a expert in physics. They use nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy to look inside the cells of the skeletal muscles and confirm the earliest detectable finding was increased intramyocellular lipid to cause insulin resistance. So that's rather fascinating. That's a big thing to know, because what does that mean? It means if you're diabetic, type 2, for example, cut down on your dietary fat and you'll be so much better off. You might come off your insulin. If you're type 1, you'll decrease your insulin injection dosages. I mean, that's a wonderful thing. You'll decrease insulin resistance. You'll increase the health of every cell in your body. Okay, next thing, I was going to talk about animal protein being a poison. Animal protein and plant protein are different. They're not the same thing. And animal food tends to have much higher protein, and the body's not made for that. Okay, when a person eats a lot of meat with high protein, it puts a lot of increased workload on the kidney. And it's animal protein in particular, they tend to go into what is called hyperfiltration. And that's like the kidney having to work double shift or triple shift, and it wears the kidneys out. It predisposes to an accelerated rate of kidney dysfunction. Tons of people, I see them all the time, every day, after 55 years of age, even after 50, they start having progressively declining kidney function. The other secret, not a lot of people know this, lots of young guys these days are putting themselves into kidney failures with all these protein supplements that they take for weightlifting. You know, I think biologically, a boy hits puberty and then he wants to grow his muscles. He wants to go off with the men and do what men do. So, young guys love lifting weights. Plus, that's that real high testosterone phase of their life. And then they want to cheat a little and start taking all these protein supplements. But it's a very dangerous thing to do. There was a Consumer Reports article, there's a couple of them, 2008, 2012, about heavy metal contaminants in those protein supplements. So I'm just saying is I would recommend don't take any of those protein supplements, because I've seen a lot of guys in kidney failure. For what? You don't need it, okay? You're just hurting yourself. All right, next thing, meat's often salted, so you got all the sodium issues. The reason why sodium chloride can cause a low-grade metabolic acidosis is because the chloride will displace the bicarbonate ions in the blood, and you don't want acidosis. Acidosis slightly increases your risk of cancer. Acidotic milieu favors cancer. In addition, the body has to buffer that pH, and it'll typically take calcium ions from the bone and it'll excrete those through the kidneys, because calcium excretion through the kidneys is coupled to proton excretion, thus readjusting the pH. So that's why the calcium buffer system works. The other thing that'll cause that buffering is animal protein has more methionine and cysteine, sulfur-containing amino acids. Part of their metabolic degradation is to be converted into sulfuric acid, again causing a low-grade metabolic acidosis, again being buffered by leaching calcium from the bone with subsequent excretion from the kidneys, calciuria, and that's coupled to proton excretion. In addition, that calcium excretion into the kidneys will sometimes precipitate. Precipitation of calcium in the kidney tubules, first of all, it causes kidney failure over time because it plugs up the kidney tubules. And if the precipitate is large, it'll form kidney stones, and those kidney stones can be very painful. My father had a kidney stone. He said it was like being kicked by a horse. A lot of people tell you kidney stone is really painful because it gets stuck in the ureter. The ureter keeps peristalsis. It hurts. And then to take them out, see my thumb? It's about 1 centimeter in diameter. That's the size of a urologist's cystoscope. You got to stick that up your Johnson, try to come up with a retrograde basket and fish out the stone, or maybe do lithotripsy. It's painful. It's no fun. No guy wants that up the Johnson, okay? So you don't want kidney stones. So that's another reason to avoid eating a lot of animal protein. Methionine is an essential amino acid for cancer growth. Meat increases ILGF, insulin-like growth factor, and that increases your risk of cancer, because these are things that stimulate cell proliferation. And you sometimes hear a young guy, a weightlifter, say, man, I got to eat meat because I want to get big and strong. Meat eaters are bigger and stronger than plant eaters. And what I would tell them is, I do think meat actually does help a young guy to build muscle a little bit faster. But man, after 40 years of age, I'd say after 35 years of age, it's a dangerous thing. You don't want to be eating things that are going to speed up your rate of cell replication, because they're potentially speeding up your rate of cell replication in cancer growth. In addition, it's believed that they accelerate the rate at which you reach the Hayflick limit. Typical somatic cell in your body, like non-germ cells, for example, non-stem cells, they can only divide about 60 times. You can look up Hayflick, the name of the researcher who figured this out on the internet. And the point I'm saying is they can only divide about 60 times. If you speed up the rate at which those cells are dividing, you accelerate your aging, the point at which they reach the Hayflick limit whereby they can no longer divide. And then they go into senescence and they can't divide their way out of a problem. And they're aged. You die sooner. All right, next thing is leucine. Meat has more leucine. Leucine is a special amino acid that tends to be the rate-limiting step for activation of mTOR. mTOR is mammalian targeted rapamycin, and it is a nutrient-sensing pathway like a building contractor. Before you're going to build a building, you got to make sure you got all the building materials. And leucine tends to be the rate-limiting step. So being widely available in meat, it predisposes to more rapid cell growth and cell replication, which is worrisome in the context of cancer. So what am I trying to say? If I had cancer, I would never take one bite of meat. Never. Okay? It's the thing that you worry about for cancer is these tumor promoters, and meat is loaded with tumor promoters. Okay? It's also got other unhealthy metabolites related to it, like secondary bile salts increasing your risk of colon cancer, heterocyclic amines. Probably the most famous book ever written about the relationship between animal protein and cancer would be the China study by T. Colin Campbell. He wrote several other books. He's got a lot of lectures online. He's good. And his experience was that the higher the amount of animal protein, the more cancer there was, and the faster cancer grew. So I would recommend avoiding that. I would avoid sodium chloride. I'd keep that to a minimum as well. And a lot of times you don't know. Somebody will say, well, prove it. And I got news for you. There's tons of stuff that's not proven. You simply look at all the evidence and you say, what is the wisest judgment in this context? Do I gain anything by putting more salt on my food? No. Well, then I potentially lose a lot, maybe a super lot. I will thus minimize it. That's how I would look at it. Okay, common diseases. I made a mnemonic here, just kind of a nonsense mnemonic, like an acronym. And the point I'm going to say is, these are the most common diseases. These are what'll probably kill you. These are what'll probably kill almost everyone you love. So it's useful to know about them. And then here's the good news. A vegan diet prevents almost all of these completely, diminishes, cancer. It doesn't prevent it completely, but it diminishes the incidence of it. Vegan diet, low-fat vegan diet. When I say vegan diet, I mean health vegan. Low fat, no oil, I recommend no caffeine. Okay.
Okay. About alcohol.
Common, like I said, all these diseases, most important diseases. And then you say, well, what proof for that? Well, there's a lot of proof. For example, atherosclerosis, Esselstyn had essentially 100% cure, his July 2014 Family Practice Journal paper. 198 patients, 99.4% no recurrent coronary artery or cerebral vascular events. One patient with a cerebral vascular event didn't follow the diet, actually. So, I mean, that's about as good as it gets, okay? When you put in stents for, let's just say, chronic angina, you don't have any increase in all-cause mortality, all right? You're just fixing a focal stenosis, but you're not treating the overall problem of diffuse atherosclerosis in the coronaries. Kempner also showed reversible atherosclerosis. There's been a whole bunch of stuff on that. Okay, Dr. Ornish as well showed some halting the progression and some reversal of coronary artery atherosclerosis in his papers as well. Okay, hypertension. Like I said, I think the best book ever written on hypertension is this one called, what is it called? The High Blood Pressure Solution. This guy devoted his whole life, MD, PhD, to research in hypertension. And his main conclusion was reducing sodium is the most important thing. There's more to hypertension than that. But that's an extraordinarily useful thing. We'll talk about it some more because it relates to the physiology of individual cells. Kempner also, that was one of the biggest things he did, was try to reduce sodium intake in his hypertension patients, and he had incredible results. Cancer is the least well understood of all these diseases, but one of the things, if you read about patients who had great outcomes, read about the Ornish study with the prostate cancer, read about all these incredible survivors who survived metastatic cancer, all these bizarre things. Almost every single one of them went vegan. Okay. Read Radical Emissions by Kelly Turner. The more you read about it, you'll see that that's the case. All right. Next thing, kidney failure. Yeah, the best thing you can do to protect your kidneys is go vegan. We can maybe talk about that later. Kempner showed that too. He'd have some patients in pretty severe kidney dysfunction, put them on a vegan diet, and he helped a lot of them. Not all of them. He helped as many as he could, and he helped a lot of them. Autoimmune disease, I think we spoke a little bit about that earlier. Leaky gut seems to be the primary mechanism. If I had an autoimmune disease, let's say MS or one of the other ones, I would go through the list of every single thing that causes leaky gut, and I would avoid every single one of those causes. And I think that that'll just improve your health overall, and it'll potentially dramatically improve your health. Roy Swank has got the best results of any doctor in the world for treatment of multiple sclerosis. I've seen lots of patients that don't lower their fat intake. They don't do as well. So, and that's a pretty severe disease, because autoimmune disease, that can get you at a young age and just ruin your life. Okay. Kind of like cancer. Breast cancer can kind of get a woman at a young age and ruin her life. Versus a lot of these other things, atherosclerosis, you think, well, I'll worry about that when I'm older, okay? But anyways, all right, next, diabetes. Diabetes, there's been a lot written about the importance of reducing lipid intake. And, Dr. Madhu, of course, is a great expert. He's gone back through all the papers of the 1920s with Sweeney's paper and Hemsworth's paper. Neil Bernard's written a ton about it. Kempner figured out too. Look at the Asians, they're all skinny with no diabetes. There's something good about this rice diet, okay? It works. All right. Let's see what else. And then dementia. CDOG is just a mnemonic I have for cataracts, diabetes, age-related macular degeneration, hypertension, hypertensive retinopathy, and glaucoma. And the point I say that is almost every cognitively impaired patient I look at has these eye problems. I'm telling you, they're related to brain problems. And I figured it out too. The same patients that got hypertensive retinopathy, glaucoma, they're the ones that got cerebral microbleeds, hypertensive encephalopathy, bleeds in their brain. We're going to talk a little bit more about Delatorre. Delatorre is really interesting. Delatorre was this researcher in mice. I'll come to the slide on him in a little bit. I mentioned Trempe here. Trempe is a Harvard ophthalmologist, and he's just another one of these guys who's written a lot about, he can see so-called Alzheimer's in the eye, beta amyloid deposits, ischemic neurons, years in advance before the patient clinically is officially diagnosed with Alzheimer's. I actually think there's lots of people walking around cognitively impaired that are not ready for an official diagnosis of Alzheimer's, but they're cognitively impaired. And the good news of this talk, like why am I so excited about this? Why do I love doing this? Why do I write books about it? Because it's the most powerful thing in all of medicine. It is the vegan diet. Like I said, I'm a high-tech doctor and I love this stuff because it's so powerful. I like high-tech too, but this stuff, I mean, for the sake of your own health, for the sake of someone you care about, this is really powerful healing stuff, all this vegan diet stuff. A little bit about disease causation. Well, I'll just mention one thing about stroke. Back in when I was doing a fellowship at this place at Rush University, we would see about 3 acute strokes a day. I would see about 3,000 old strokes every day, looking at brain MRIs. In an entire year, 2 patients had their stroke successfully cured by transcatheter thrombectomy, pulling the catheter out. And so what am I saying here? You have to learn how to take care of yourself, how to save your own health. For a stroke, yeah, it is true. There are some fantastic endovascular catheter techniques that can potentially reverse a stroke, but it almost never happens. It's a rare event that somebody gets to a hospital on time, that the brain tissue is still intact, that the thrombus can be removed. Yes, it does happen, and it's a wonderful thing, and it's a great technical achievement, but it's rare. The vast majority of strokes are finalized events, and they damage a lot of brain tissue, and it's sad. So you want to prevent strokes. Okay, let's see. A lot of this stuff we've started to talk about it. I'll go into more on the individual slides. I just talked about the relationship between all these eye diseases in the brain. The other thing is when somebody's falling a lot. When I hear somebody's falling a lot, to me, that means they're demented until proven otherwise. The reason I say that is, why do animals have brains, but plants do not? Hold on a second. I'm going to close the door in this room. It's a little noisy here. The reason that animals have a brain is because they move around. Once you walk, you have to know where you are. You have to have a destination. You have to make a value judgment. I'll walk towards the food. I'll stay away from the danger. And so a huge part of our brain, more of our brain is devoted to movement than it is to thinking. You got 70% of the neurons in your brain are in your cerebellum, the little tiny part in the back, and they're short, fine intraneurons for coordinating movement. So what I'm trying to say is when you hear old guys falling a lot, usually that means, his brain's not working. Sometimes it turns out to be something else, but I say all these things because in my experience, tons of people are far sicker than they realize. Oh, I'm just falling a little bit. It's no big deal. I just have mild hypertension. I just have mild diabetes. It's under control. They don't understand. They're on the highway to terrible suffering and dementia and death. They don't get it. Okay. And what I'm saying is vegan diet in many instances, tremendous, in the majority, could slow it down. I mean, sometimes pills can help too. Sometimes they need surgery, all that. But trust me, the vegan diet is really a powerful thing. Okay, dementia. I've seen thousands of brains. And like I said, the most common thing I see is the brain is shrinking. Just diffuse cerebral atrophy. I'll sometimes get MRIs from 20 years earlier, and I just see this progressive shrinking of the cortical tissue in the brain. And what I'm getting it as, when you have a stroke, you could point right to the spot. Let's say I've got a stroke here. I can look at this. Let's say this was a brain. Right there's a stroke. Actually, the brain looks like a fist. Let me see if I can make a fist show up here. I have both my hands that go towards me. It's kind of hard to get into the picture. So here'd be the frontal lobes. Here's the parietal lobe. Here's the temporal lobe. Here's the occipital lobe. The point I'm saying is when there's a stroke, you could point to it. It means a total lack of blood supply to that piece of brain tissue such that it infarcts, dead brain. Its plasma membrane lyses. It releases its contents. There's this big inflammatory response with edema. Stroke right there. Okay. And the reason I tell you that is that's not what usually happens. Most people just have a shrunken brain, and that's due to apoptosis. It means a partial deprivation of oxygen or glucose such that the brain, the cell dies, but it recycles itself, allowing its organelles and its molecules to be used by other cells. And it's ingested by the immune system. Let's say the microglia, they'll phagocytize it, they'll ingest it, okay? And that means that there's no inflammatory response. You can't see anything on an MRI but a shrinking brain. All right, now here I'm going to talk a little bit now about Jack Delatorre. So Jack Delatorre was a PhD who did his research primarily on mice. He would tie off the mouse's carotid artery in the neck. And what he found was the mouse would typically become demented about 2 months later, and then they would do autopsies on the mice. And the interesting thing about it was they usually didn't see a stroke. They usually saw a shrunken atrophic brain. And This led him to the conclusion that the most common reason in his mice research for cognitive impairment was chronic cerebral hypoperfusion. And so what I'm saying here is anything that drops perfusion to the brain, you can think of it as a mouse equivalent. And this will be one of the most important things you can get from this talk. There are many things that can cause a mouse equivalent and deprive your brain of what it needs. First of all, let's talk about hypertension. I view hypertension as very dangerous. There is a narrow therapeutic window. If the pressure is too high, you can get bleeds into the brain. You can get a big bleed, and the patients often die from that. It's a dramatic event, but you'll also routinely get these little tiny bleeds. I see tons of them every day. They're called cerebral microbleeds. They're especially concentrated centrally in the brain, in the basal ganglia, if you will. That's your classic hypertensive encephalopathy. But guess what? I see them in the periphery all the time. And it used to be people say, well, if a cerebral microbleed is in the periphery, therefore it's indicative of cerebral amyloid angiopathy. No, that's not true. I see it in 40-year-olds all the time. Okay, I mean, don't get me wrong. It's much more common as a person gets older, but I've seen tons of them in patients in their 40s. What I'm trying to say is the spectrum between hypertensive cerebral microbleeds and cerebral amyloid angiopathy bleeds, peripheral bleeds, central bleeds, they're all mixed. I see every imaginable pattern you could think of. There is no strong distinction between the two, okay? Hypertension's bad. Pressure too high, dangerous. You can bleed into your brain. But let's say your pressure is too low. Let's say you're over-treating it, okay? You're too worried about it and you over-treat it. You drop your pressure too low, then you're chronically under-perfusing your brain. Your body has a lot of internal sensors to make sure your brain gets enough blood flow. So you got to be careful about dropping your blood pressure too low, or you will chronically underperfuse your brain. Mouse equivalent, you're screwed, okay? It's going to lead to brain cells going to apoptosis. And now here's where it gets worse. Let's say you got diabetes. You got diabetes, very dangerous. You know why? They started giving diabetic patients these chronic glucose monitors or continuous glucose monitors. They call them CGMs. And guess what they found? A lot of diabetic patients were becoming hypoglycemic at night. Very dangerous. Your brain needs glucose. Your brain wants to burn glucose. If you look at a FDG PET scan, you can type this into your browser, look up FDG PET scan, look at the brain. What you will see is the brain is the most aggressive user of glucose of any tissue in the body, by far. The only thing remotely close would be the left ventricle. So what I'm trying to say is, if you drop that glucose supply to your brain, it's dangerous. You could lose neurons. And a lot of diabetics are dropping their blood glucose levels at night. They didn't used to know this because they would only do a finger stick, a couple times a day. But now when they're checking those CGMs through the night, a lot of them have significant hypoglycemia events. And I believe these are mouse equivalents predisposing them to dementia. And I can tell you, diabetics, it's pretty routine that they're cognitive impaired. More often than not, when I speak to a diabetic, they're cognitively impaired. They're very cognitively slow. And they almost have like this lack of awareness. I'm like, dude, I don't say it that way. They're about to get their foot amputated, their toes amputated, their legs amputated, they're going blind. And I sort of try to talk to them about nutrition and health, and they kind of look at me, oh, at my age, what are you going to do? My diabetes, it's reasonably well controlled. I'm like, you don't get it, okay? Next, let's talk about obstructive sleep apnea, OSA. So here's where I'm at on the slide, if you care. OSA, very dangerous again. So obstructive sleep apnea is a condition which I was taught when I was a medical student. They've got a prominent airway tissues, let's say fatty tissues in their airway, and it'll obstruct their throat at night, especially if they lay flat on their back. I don't believe it. Okay, now here's what I'll tell you. I look at the nasal pharynx and the oral pharynx many times every day. I've never once in my life seen anything in the nasal pharynx, oral pharynx to explain sleep apnea. And there are some papers coming out now that it might be a central neuropathy. I can also tell you, not all sleep apnea patients are fat. Everyone used to think obstructive sleep apnea patients are always fat. Not all of them are that fat. So anyways, why is it a big deal? Because nowadays they do sleep studies and they'll put a pulse ox on the patient's finger or they'll check their oxygen saturation levels overnight. And many of them are dropping their saturations for prolonged amounts of time at night. They're like the mouse equivalents. You see what I'm saying? How these brains can be destroyed? A lot of these sleep apnea patients are also diabetic. So they're dropping their glucose supply, hypoglycemia in the nighttime. They're dropping their oxygen supply in the nighttime. They're hypoxic. Let's say they ate a fat meal. Additional hypoxia due to the rouleau formation from the fat causing the RBCs to stick together. Let's say they're on hypertension and they're over-treating it. Now they're hypotensive. They're dropping the blood supply to the brain. Okay, additional things that are like mouse equivalents are, let's look at atrial fibrillation. Everybody says AFib, big cause of stroke. You form a thrombus in the left atrial appendage and it passes to the brain. That's an embolism when it passes to another location. But guess what? The main reason atrial fibrillation decreases cognitive function is chronic cerebral hypoperfusion. Other things will do that too, congestive heart failure. So what I'm trying to say is a lot of people, they don't have one thing affecting their brain. They got 10 or 15. So the smart move is go through all of them to the extent you can and try to avoid all the stuff that might decrease your brain's function. Another very under-recognized thing is inhibitors of what's called SERCA, and that is a sarcoplasm endoplasmic reticulum calcium ATPase, which is basically part of the cytoplasm concentration calcium regulation mechanism inside a cell. And when a person starts losing calcium, ability to regulate calcium in the cell, they overactivate their neurons. So we don't have that much time to get into SERCA inhibitors, but I can tell you there's a great book. It's written by this lady. I don't know if I got a copy of it around here. Her name is Brundy Brody, okay? And her kid had some calcium metabolism problem that nobody knew what it was initially. And she went and got help from some doctors and scientists, and they figured it out. And it's a great book because she goes through all the SERCA inhibitors. So that's another sort of side track. I sometimes found that when mothers have a sick child and they really search out the cause, they sometimes come up with incredible discoveries. I was really impressed by that. Okay, what else? If you're not eating plants, you're going to be low in potassium and magnesium. Those are vasodilators, increase blood supply to your brain. If you're eating meat and junk food, you're going to be high in sodium. And quite often, a lot of times, well, we won't talk too much about calcium right now, but you're vasoconstricting with the sodium and dropping blood supply to your brain. Okay, so you see how you can have multiple things diminishing blood supply, nutrient supply to the brain. You're going to lose neurons and you're going to end up cognitively impaired. All right, so the SAD diet, along with all these other bad habits here, lead to progressive neuronal death and cognitive impairment, which is sort of a polite way of saying dementia. Okay, there's mild dementia, moderate, severe. We talked here about sleep apnea. Another thing too, be careful what sport your kid plays. I've seen a lot of kids get brain damage from playing soccer. Everybody thinks, oh, soccer is so great. I think soccer is totally stupid. I'll tell you why. Don't get me wrong. I think kicking the ball is great. I actually think they should make it against the rules. You're not allowed to hit the ball with your head. Hitting the ball with your head is stupid. It's like saying, go ahead, punch me. Okay. Just because you call it heading a ball, it's the same effect as being punched in the head. So everybody knows there's some sports like boxing cause a lot of cognitive impairment, but soccer, not a good idea. You don't want your kid hitting the ball with his head. I'm just letting you know because I've seen a lot of sad injuries. I've seen kids have to drop out of college due to brain damage from hitting the soccer ball with their head. Okay, dietary iron, that's kind of a big subject. I became fascinated by the biochemistry of iron. I read like 4 books on the biochemistry of iron. I was so fascinated by it. And eventually, I can also tell you too, some of the smartest doctors in the world I know, they donate blood on purpose to lower their blood ferritin levels. That's a carrier protein for iron. It's actually a storage protein for iron. Okay, let's see what else. There's a lot of things that will impair cognitive function. And so all I'm saying is make a list of all of them if you want to optimize your brain function and avoid the things that impair brain function. Iron, we'll talk about it sometime later because, that's a big, long subject, but it's a secret, fascinating subject because iron will connect. You want to learn about beta amyloid hypothesis. You want to learn about dormant bacteria. You want to learn about the role of LPS, effect on fibrinogen. You got to go into all this iron stuff. And it is a fascinating thing, but it's a big, long subject. Coronary artery disease, we've talked about that. One thing I'll just mention to you, you hear a lot of so-called cholesterol skeptics on the internet. Oh, I don't believe cholesterol increases the risk of myocardial infarction. Yeah, right. Take a look at the Mr. Fit trial. Okay, initially came out in 1986, follow up in JAMA 2008, 356,000 men. Okay, the higher the cholesterol, the higher the number of coronary events. And the reason why I think that's pretty relevant is, it's a giant sample set. But I would tell you something else, though. I did observe something. I look at patients that have problems, and I correlate it with their history. And here's what I saw. A lot of older guys are very sick. They're having strokes and cardiac events, needing pacemakers. And you look at the cholesterol level, and it's not that high. And so I say to myself, they're sort of a different category, but these are a post-modification cohort. These patients very routinely are on statins and other lipid-lowering drugs. And what I'm basically getting at here is the older a person gets, the more fragile they are. And because they are more fragile, they need to do more things. Because a lot of these patients, I think they're poor, they're old, they're on Social Security, they're just eating a little bit of junk food every day. So, and then with the medications, they're not that hyperlipidemic. But because of their fragility and their baseline damage, they're still at high risk for vascular disease. And you would say, well, how do I know they've got vascular disease? And I'll tell you why. Because I look at CAT scans of their head, their neck, and their chest, and their arteries are all calcified. So their arteries are extensively damaged. That's also why you want to try to get your act together. The sooner the better, but especially try to get going on improving your diet and health. If you haven't done sooner, do it by around 35 years of age if possible, because the longer you are hypertensive, the more you damage your artery. A chronically contracted artery because of high sodium will become increasingly fibrotic. Your ascending thoracic aorta normally dilates with every heartbeat. And that's called the Windkessel effect. It has elastic fibers, so it can stretch during contraction of the heart, during systole. And then during diastole, those elastic fibers pull inward. That's called elastic recoil. And they maintain diastolic flow, both up to the rest of the body and down retrograde into the coronary arteries. And so what I'm saying is you can't replace those elastic fibers in your ascending thoracic aorta after 20 years of age. So a lot of people, they've lost most of their Windkessel effect by the time they're 35. So they're totally predisposed to hypertension. This is also why you see a lot more systolic hypertension as people get older and less diastolic, because they've got hardly any diastolic flow. And so again, what I'm trying to say is you want to try to keep those elastic fibers as much as you can. And you do that by avoiding, let's say, the dietary fat, which is going to predispose to Rouleau, and avoiding the dietary sodium, predisposing to vasoconstriction. Okay, next topic I was going to briefly talk about was estrogen. How many minutes do I got, AJ?
Well, how many minutes do you need?
Oh, I'm having fun. I'll talk as long as you let me.
Well, let's see. I have to teach a class at 2:00 and I'd like a lunch break. So maybe another half hour.
Okay, thanks.
Oh, no problem.
We'll talk a little bit about estrogen. Estrogen is a very interesting molecule, and this is easy to learn, estrogen chemistry. Hardly anybody knows it, but it's easy to learn. Let me try to get you a good book to start.
Hey,
Okay,
Doc,
here's a good book. This guy's name is his name's Anthony J. I don't know if you could see it. He wrote a book called Estrogen Generation. He's a PhD in biochemistry, and he wrote a book about estrogen chemistry, and I like him. I think he's smart. He's a young guy, though, and in my experience, you show me a young guy, less than 35 or 40, and I'll show you a guy who's an idiot when it comes to nutrition. And why do I say that? Young guys are just married to this idea of, I got to eat more meat so I can have big muscles, and a lot of them are paleo. But I'll tell you what happens. As soon as they have a erectile dysfunction episode, or one of their friends has a coronary event or something like that, they start going, maybe I got to start learning about diet and lipids. All right. But anyways, let's talk about estrogen chemistry. If you look at an estrogen molecule, I don't got any way to draw it. Let's see here. Sorry about that. But the ring of estrogen, it's a steroid hormone, but the bottom corner ring has a bunch of double bonds in it. It's got 3 double bonds in it. That makes it a benzene ring. So I got the word benzene right here. A benzene ring, what that means is the electrons, or what are called the pi orbitals, they can go through all 6 of those carbons. It's a cyclohexane with 3 double bonds. So the pi orbitals, they're super stable. You can leave it on a shelf for 5 years and it's not going to change. Corporations love chemicals with good shelf stability. It means the product doesn't get returned. All right. And then you have a hydroxyl group attached to it. The hydroxyl group is just an OH group. And that combination of a benzene ring with a phenol coming off it is antimicrobial. So you got good shelf life and you got antimicrobial properties. That means no mold can grow in the product. So what am I saying? This is the most common preservative you're going to see in all these cosmetics. All right. And so it's everywhere. These things are never going to go away. Even if you ban one of them, like there was an attempt to ban BPA in plastics, they're just going to switch out one component of it. It's still going to be the same thing. So what I'm trying to say is you have to learn how to save yourself. Don't expect the world to change. The only thing you can change in the world is yourself. Learn the simple chemistry of these estrogenic molecules and avoid them. Okay. And so what's the most common problem you'll talk about? Let's talk about deodorant. Okay. You guys might already know this. You probably do, but I'll just real quick go through it. Women take deodorant. Okay. And they're sticking this thing in their armpit every day. Men do it too. And that deodorant, typically it's got Aluminum is a metalloestrogen. It activates estrogen pathways. I'm not exactly sure of the mechanism, but it does. It also plugs up the sweat pores to cause decreased sweating. That's why they put aluminum in deodorant. But here's the problem. The lymphatics between your armpit and the breast, especially the upper outer quadrant, they are shared. So you're dumping a metalloestrogen into the breast every day. In addition, number 2, you're going to have a power-benzoic acid, like I was talking about, a benzene ring with a hydroxyl group, preservative in almost all of these deodorants. So that is also going into your upper outer quadrant of your breast. The lymphatics between the armpit and the breast are shared. Number 3, the concept of, in chemistry, biochemistry, like dissolves like, meaning that these estrogen molecules are lipophilic. They're like fat. Okay, your skin is primarily made out of lipid. So it's designed to keep water out. It's not designed to keep lipid out. So lipid things in cosmetic, these preservatives, power-benzoic acid preservatives, for example, they are rapidly transdermally absorbed. And what do a lot of people do? They shave their armpits. So you're shaving your armpit, and then you're putting all these estrogens in there. You're getting tremendous transdermal absorption, and it's especially going to that upper outer quadrant. The incidence of breast cancer in the upper outer quadrant, you go back, I don't know, in the 1920s or so, it was about 25%. Now it's about 60%. So it's increasing as people are putting more deodorant on themselves and other chemicals. My advice is you don't need deodorant. When you see somebody, you go, hey, how you doing? You don't walk up to them and smell their armpit. You know, we're not like a dog smelling each other when we say hello. You don't need deodorant, all right? The next thing is all these chemicals, okay? You know, what's the secret? Dave Barry had said this of a happy marriage, separate bathrooms, okay? A little bit of a joke there, but the point I'm making is my wife and I got a separate bathroom, all right? How many cosmetic products do you think I have in my bathroom? Of course, you know I'm a minimalist by this point. 0, none, okay? In my wife's bathroom, 55 cosmetic products, okay, of some sort. And I'm saying, you know, look at the chemicals in these things. You don't even know what you're putting on yourself. They've all got power-benzoic acid or some type of similar preservative. For example, a lot of people like to go lay out in the sun and they put sunscreen on themselves. I think that's a big mistake. There are powerful chemicals in sunscreens that are estrogenic, okay, like benzophenone, for example. And the ultraviolet light will sometimes stick them to make them adherent to the estrogen receptor for a prolonged estrogenic effect. In addition, they'll put nanoparticles, they're so-called penetration enhancers in these sunscreens, increasing the absorption into the body. And I worry that the nanoparticles are potentially absorbed into the body, and I worry that they might even potentially cross the blood-brain barrier. Do I know that for sure? No. But I've asked a couple experts in those fields of medicine and science related to that, and they say they would worry about it too. So we don't know. And so again, you come to a risk-benefit ratio. Do I gain anything by this? No. You know what I do for the sun? I walk outside, I'll take my shirt off, I'll read a book outside for a half hour in the sun. I get all the vitamin D I need. All right, so that's what I recommend. Get your sunshine, but don't be using sunscreen is my advice, because I think you're increasing your risk of cancer potentially more than you think. All right, what else? Be careful about all these soaps. In general, a soap is going to have something like an emulsifier that's amphiphilic, both hydrophilic and hydrophobic, okay? So the reason is you'll have stains that'll be lipophilic on your clothing, and then your laundry detergent is going to be amphiphilic to pull that lipid into the aqueous solution. And these are very often estrogens, like non-oxynol 9 is a common laundry detergent. So what am I trying to tell you? Laundry, here's what I do. You don't have to do what I do, but if you want to lower your breast cancer risk, you think about it. I use no laundry detergent. I just do extra hot water, big deal. If you look in other countries, that's what they've done for centuries. They just boil their laundry. You don't need to be putting all this detergent on it. And think about it. Let's say you use liquid laundry detergent in a plastic bottle. The plastic bottle is estrogen number 1, very often with BPA, a powerful estrogen. Number 2, the plastic conditioner is a phthalate, okay? And that very often dissolves into the liquid. Liquid laundry detergent, that's going to be something like, let's say, non-oxynol 9. Again, estrogenic. So that's 3 estrogen. And quite often those little dryer sheets that people put, the softeners in the dryer, those are also estrogenic. So then what happens is you got that on your clothes. All day long, your clothes are touching your skin, and these estrogens are being transdermally absorbed into your body. Like I was saying, normal levels of estrogen in the body are about 20 to 400 nanograms. And these exogenous chemical estrogens, estrogen-like chemicals, they can get up into the thousands. So you're dramatically cranking up your estrogen levels. That's not a smart thing to be doing. If you drink an estrogen in your food or you eat a meat with estrogen in it, at least it's going to go through your portal vein to your liver, where the liver is going to have a first pass effect to detoxify it. But when you just put it on your skin all day long, it's being transdermally absorbed. There is no first pass effect. It doesn't go to your liver, it just goes right into your bloodstream. All right. What else can I say about these chemicals? I've seen a lot of things. I've seen women come up and tell me, Dr. Rogers, every person in my family, every woman had to get a hysterectomy before 35 years of age. I'm going to bet you that's from water estrogens. Why do I say that? Municipal water filtration, their job is to prevent acute infections. So they put chlorine in the water, for example, to sanitize it, prevent acute bacterial infections. But guess what? They don't care that much about removing estrogens. It's very expensive to try to remove all that estrogens. And they often add aluminum to the water because it's a clarifier. So you're potentially drinking very high levels of atrazine, BPA, and other chemicals that are quite often estrogenic, and the aluminum that's estrogenic from your drinking water. Okay, you should test your drinking water. I recommend for your house, your entire house, you have a whole house carbon water filter, because that removes the chlorine at your house, which can cause leaky gut, and it also removes the estrogens. I actually recommend for your kitchen too. I think it's good to have a reverse osmosis water filter. Those are a little more expensive, probably in the ballpark of around $600. A whole house carbon filter is expensive too, about $1,500. I know it's a lot of money, but I'm just saying for health, my opinion, I think these are important things. For a more detailed book, you could read Philippa Darbra. She's a lady from England, PhD scientist, and she's done a lot of research on estrogenic chemicals, a lot of really impressive research. Okay, let's say you want to avoid breast cancer. So all the stuff we talked about, milk, watch out for milk. I would never drink milk. They now have engineered the cows to make milk while they're pregnant. Their estrogen's off the chart. And a lot of people think, well, I think it's good to give my child whole milk. I don't think so. A lot of girls are going into accelerated premature puberty, and I think drinking whole milk is contributing to that. Okay, what else could we do to avoid the risk of breast cancer? I said that I think sodium chloride, I'd be concerned about it because the chloride can displace the bicarbonates, cause low-grade metabolic acidosis. It's a minor point, but when you're worried about cancer, it's a good idea to be meticulous, all right? Let's see, what else? No processed food. Just the food dyes will often be estrogenic from eating processed foods. They put things to prevent, just like sunscreen, they put some of those sunscreen-like chemicals into plastics, for example, into a car seat. Like I had a cousin of mine, and we had to go somewhere, and it was with someone else who had a relatively new car, and he's sitting there smelling the car seat. And I'm like, why are you doing that? And he goes, it smells like a woman. And I go, you know what? That's going to be some toxic petrochemical or something. And I didn't think about it. I thought it was kind of a goofy comment. But later on, I read these chemicals are estrogenic. They often do smell a little bit like women, and men like the smell of that. And the benzene rings are called aromatics because they have a relatively nice smell. So all I'm trying to say is don't be smelling stuff. And also, how am I in my behavior? I try to be a little close to nature. For example, look at your dog, all right? If you look at your dog and you put a bar of soap near your dog's nose, your dog would go, hey, what are you doing? Get that away from me. And so why am I saying that for? A lot of people, in my experience, they're not at all afraid of chemicals. They think they have to put dishwasher soap on every single dish. They just open the dishwasher and that whole smell comes right out when somebody's eating right next to it. You should be a little bit afraid of chemicals, okay? You don't want excessive estrogen exposures, and a lot of these other cleaning chemicals, they're toxic in some other way. A lot of them are SERCA inhibitors. Meaning sarcoplasm, endoplasmic reticulum, calcium, ATPase inhibitors, both in your brain and in your other tissues, like in your heart. They're not good for you. Okay, watch out for stress. We talked a little bit about stress already, but in addition, stress will cause increased cortisol. Cortisol suppresses your immune system. If you suppress your immune system, it is your immune system that protects you from cancer. You don't want to suppress your immune system. So anything that raises your cortisol is not good for your immune system. In addition, there's another thing to watch out for with excessive psychological stress and stress equivalents, meaning caffeine, lack of sleep, tobacco, also being a stimulant. A little bit different with tobacco, but my point is this. When you increase catecholamines, the catecholamines can function as siderophores. A siderophore is a chemical that facilitates the transfer of iron, and that is highly relevant because an infection very often, like let's say a bacterial infection, it needs iron to grow. But guess what? A cancer cell needs iron to grow too. So these catecholamines, when present in excessive amounts, are making iron more accessible to your infections or your cancers. An interesting thing is take a look at an egg. You ever look at an egg? Let's say you look at a boiled egg. You know, you got the yolk in the center, right? And then you got the egg white in the periphery. Do you know why it's like that? An egg has to have some gaseous interaction with the external environment. So bacteria can potentially go through that shell and get into that egg. Well, guess what? They don't get to the yolk. You know why? Because there's no iron in the egg white. And by depriving the egg white segment of iron, a bacteria can't grow through it. It's kind of like a man can't walk across a big desert because there's no water. Okay, cancer and infections need iron to grow. So, all right. So that was my point, why the stress-related catecholamines increase your risk of immune suppression and infections and cancer. A lot of these soaps, moldy grains. Yeah, there's a whole list of them. I've got some videos at my YouTube channel, Peter Rogers, MD. And, you know, I hope it's pretty easy to learn about. I wrote a big book too one time, you don't mind me showing this, called How to Reduce the Risk of Chronic Disease, where I go through all this biochemistry, estrogens and stuff. But there's a lot of places you can learn about it. It's good to know. It's so easy to avoid them once you know them. And I think you can drop your estrogen levels dramatically. All right, so here's another question. Do hysterectomies make you stupid? And I can tell you, if a woman gets a hysterectomy before the age of 35 years, she is at markedly increased risk for hypertension, stroke, earlier cognitive impairment, and earlier coronary artery disease. And the reason is women have a health advantage from menstruation. Menstruation every month is like what one would describe as a therapeutic phlebotomy. There actually is a medical benefit to therapeutic phlebotomy. What happens is you lower the hematocrit. When you lower the hematocrit, red blood cells are like 99% of the blood cells in your blood. You then make your blood less thick, more like water, less like a milkshake. And that lowers your blood pressure, which has a protective effect to prevent atherosclerosis. So there is a therapeutic benefit to monthly menstruation. And I can tell you this, I know some of the world's experts in atherosclerosis, and many of them donate blood because they want to lower their hematocrit, they want to lower their iron levels a little. The iron's a little bit of a separate topic, but it's related. So what I'm saying is, when a woman gets a hysterectomy, she takes on the risk factors like a man. She's no longer menstruating. And a lot of them maybe don't realize it, and they allow themselves to become hyperlipidemic. And I've seen a few demented women in their 50s, and nobody can figure out why. And then I dig back through their history and I find out they had hysterectomies when they were in their, around 30 years of age. Mayo Clinic did a big study on thousands of hysterectomy patients who had, and the ones who had them at a young age, they were predisposed to all kinds of cardiovascular problems, including stroke, hypertension, stroke, and dementia, and congestive heart failure. Okay, fertility. Fertility relates to all this estrogen stuff. Like I was saying, what's a typical birth control pill? EE2, ethinyl estradiol. Well, guess what? High levels of estrogen tell your body that it's pregnant, get ready for the baby, don't ovulate. But who knows what's happening with all these exogenous estrogens? So what I'm trying to say is, if I was a woman trying to get pregnant, I would make a list of all these exogenous estrogens and avoid them. And the way to do it is, think about Adam and Eve, okay, in the Garden of Eden. They didn't rub sunscreen and moisturizer and deodorant and all these wrinkle cream and all this other stuff on themselves. So be like Adam and Eve. If Adam and Eve couldn't do it, I wouldn't do it either. Okay, don't get me wrong. I love indoor housing. I love indoor plumbing. Okay, we have a lot of conveniences in the modern world and be grateful for them. But don't be rubbing chemicals on yourself for no reason. Avoid dairy. Dairy in particular is kind of a weird thing. Even if you got the enzyme to split lactose into glucose and galactose, that doesn't mean your body's able to metabolize the galactose. And galactose is thought to be relatively toxic, potentially, to ovaries, and can increase the risk of non-ovulation and can even increase the risk of ovarian cancer. I would only eat organic food. The reason I say that is I've read entire books on the toxicology of herbicides and pesticides in non-organic food, much worse than people realize. In particular, think about the pesticide atrazine. It's highly estrogenic. That's the one that turns male frogs into female frogs, okay? You don't want to eat, I recommend only eat organic food. And people sometimes say, well, I prefer grass-fed beef. And, there might be some small advantages in grass-fed beef versus CAFO beef. So CAFO means concentrated animal feeding operation, where they may be feeding it corn that was sprayed with atrazine. It's going to have high estrogen levels and other problems. But what I'm saying is, if you're trying to become pregnant, let's say you're trying to prevent breast cancer, my advice, minimize all of these as much as you can. And you can. It's very easy. Just avoid them. I mean, you don't have to rub these things on yourself. You don't have to eat foods that are high in estrogen. For example, I would never eat a canned food. The reason I say that is the inner lining of the can quite often has BPA, and the BPA often has little tears in it, and then it's in an aluminum can. So the aluminum is interacting with the substance inside, and so is the BPA. So I would just avoid it. There's a whole bunch more of these estrogenics, so I don't got that much more time to talk on these, but it's a fascinating subject. And again, what's so great about the vegan diet is anybody can do it. What's so great about this estrogen chemistry and understanding, anyone can dramatically lower their risk of breast cancer, can increase their ability to be fertile if that's what they want. In addition, the prostate in a man is like the female breast. So anything that lowers the risk of breast cancer tends to lower the risk of prostate cancer. Lots of men have prostate cancer. The smart move is prevent it. And the way you prevent it is become a vegan and avoid all this estrogenic stuff. Okay. And then, of course, there's the great orange paper showing that patients that ate primarily vegan diet, they were able to maintain their PSAs and their biopsy histology. These are biopsy-proven prostate carcinoma patients who had declined, surgery, radiation, et cetera, at that time. They were sort of the watchful waiting group. The ones who went down this path of vegan-like diet, they had repeat biopsies, and quite often their histology even improved. So anyways, what would I do? What do I personally do? I'm 58. I'm a 100% vegan, 100% plant-based, low-fat vegan, and I avoid all this estrogenic stuff. I don't even want to know my PSA because my risk is so low that the likelihood of a false positive is much greater than a diagnostic test. So smart move is don't even check a PSA if you can optimize your health. That's what I personally do because I know the relative risk ratio and I know I'm better off this way. And I don't want a big needle up that space, okay? I don't want to end up getting an unnecessary biopsy from a false positive PSA because I know my risk of cancer is really low. Screening is all about pretest probability. If your pretest probability is really, really, really low, you don't need to screen. So the smart move is get yourself into the really, really, really low pretest probability category, and you can forget about it. That's how you win the game of health, is by making your risk of coronary artery disease, hypertension, diabetes, prostate cancer, breast cancer, all these other problems so low that you can just forget about it. It's kind of like a joke, like Psalm 23. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of disease, I shall fear no disease because I got the vegan diet on my side. Okay. All right. Some people ask me, well, do I have to be a strict orthodox, low fat, low sodium, no caffeine, no oil vegan, or can I just go vegan light? And what I would tell you is, as an individual, everybody can do what they want, but my advice is try to optimize things as much as you can. I basically say to myself, if it's good for me, I'll do it. If it's not good for me, I won't do it. And I don't really care about the details. I'm not that fussy because I think that's the best way to go because I see a lot of severe disease. I'm scared of it, okay? I think that's the rational thing to be, is scared of serious, hardcore disease. Every day I see people blind, myocardial infarctions, new pacemaker, toe amputation, leg amputation, stroke, disaster after disaster, okay? People are really, really sick. And so all those diseases, almost every single one of them, is dietary or toxin related, and they're easily preventable. So I prevent them. That's, I think, the way you win the game of health. All right. So what I'm trying to say is I recommend optimize everything to the extent you can because I think you'd be much better off in the long term. Sodium is much worse, I think, than is widely recognized. Okay, so what would I say about sodium? Okay, first of all, what causes high blood pressure? I think the main thing is sodium, but there's some additional things. Excessive dietary calcium can contribute to it. Being low in potassium and magnesium, which come from plants. So if you eat plants, you're going to get more magnesium, you're going to get more potassium, the vasodilator, good stuff, and you're going to get less sodium. That's what you want. The problem just fixes yourself. And you're going to see that's the case with a lot of stuff with the low-fat vegan diet is problems just fix themselves because our ancestors from thousands of years ago are designed to eat a primarily plant-based diet. So if you just eat a primarily plant-based diet, you'll have all kinds of problems that are just fixing themselves in the background, and your individual cells are functioning better without you even realizing it. Lots of good things happen. Excessive fructose can do it. It gets converted primarily into fat in the liver. Industrial fructose I'm talking about. Excessive uric acid, which often will come from eating industrial fructose. Alcohol gets, tends to produce fatty liver, increased saturated fat in the liver. Stress, the cortisol has a little bit of a mineralocorticoid effect on the kidneys, increased sodium, volume expansion. Catecholamines, vasoconstriction with stress, also raising blood pressure. Cortisol also contributes to insulin resistance, to raise the blood glucose. The acute stress response, being chased by a tiger in the dark, you got to raise blood glucose really fast so that you got enough energy, glucose available for your skeletal muscles so they don't just become exhausted suddenly and the tiger catches you and eats you. Insomnia, stress equivalent, caffeine, stress equivalent, anything that increases blood viscosity. So all those things cause hypertension. But I can go through the sodium routine a little bit. Sodium becomes real interesting. The other thing too, we talked about it, epidemiology is great because once you see these plant-based populations, zero hypertension, it's pretty obvious. If you eat a primarily plant-based diet without added sodium, persons like the Yanomami, the rural Kenyans, rural Chinese, traditional Kuna, Australian Aborigines, Papua New Guinea, every single population you look at, they don't have hypertension. Okay, sodium. So what I'd say, if you look at sodium, potassium, they're like a seesaw. Let's see if I can, so let's just say, here's a seesaw. When you increase sodium, let's say this is increased sodium, potassium goes down. You're going to void it out of the kidney. The body has to maintain exact amounts of its electrolytes. They're both positively charged cations, +1 for sodium, +1 for potassium. So the more sodium you ingest, the more you void out your potassium. Sodium is a vasoconstrictor. Potassium is a vasodilator. The more you vasoconstrict, which means clamp down on your arteries. When your arteries are clamped down, it makes more work for your heart to pump through a narrowed system versus to pump through a vasodilated system. That causes hypertension. Okay, so it causes hypertension in a different way than fat does. Fat primarily makes your blood thick. So you're pumping a milkshake instead of water through a system, if you want to make the analogy to plumbing. All right, and I'm going to go through a little bit about the reason why that happens. Every cell in your body has a sodium potassium ATPase pumps on its plasma membrane, and they function like a battery. Just like your car needs a battery, every cell has a battery. And the main energy from that battery is stored in the electrochemical. So it's both electric based on charge. There's a negative charge in the center of the cell, and on chemical concentration. There's much higher sodium outside the cell in comparison with inside the cell. So when you allow a sodium to flow into a cell, you couple that then to other things. For example, to pump out calcium. And pumping calcium out of the cell, from the cell cytoplasm out of the cell into the extracellular matrix, is very important because calcium tends to be the on switch for making all kinds of things happen in a cell. And so the sodium potassium ATPase is pumping out 3 sodiums and then simultaneously pumping in 2 potassiums. And this is a very big deal for your cells. The neurons, for example, will have a negative charge intracellular, about -65 millivolts. They will use also about 65% of their energy to run this sodium potassium ATPase. Anytime a cell is using 2/3 of its energy to run something, that means the life of that cell is dependent on it. And so what am I saying here? I'm saying that when you have excessive sodium intake and you have a lack of plant intake such that you're diminished in your potassium and your magnesium intake, you are damaging every brain cell in your body and impairing its function. Okay, you're predisposing yourself, or if you do that for decades, to cognitive impairment. And the older you get, the more fragile you are, the more rapidly bad things happen. So the older you get, that's another reason, the more careful you want to be to avoid these problems so you can maintain all your function. All right. The resting membrane potential is called, the resting membrane potential, RMP. That's a negative charge inside the cell. We talked about the chemical gradients. Calcium being an on-off switch. For example, when calcium increases in the cytoplasm of a smooth muscle cell of an artery, that artery will constrict, predisposing to hypertension. When calcium increases in a hippocampal neuron, let's say the postsynaptic neuron in your hippocampus, your memory center of your brain, that will predispose that neuron to fire and action potential, to be more metabolically active. So that's why it also can be what's called an excitotoxicity effect, because it'll overstimulate that neuron. Let's see what else. You then will couple the sodium potassium ATPase establishes a sodium gradient, and that's coupled then to an adjacent structure called, it's right here on the slide, the sodium calcium exchanger. And it's also often called the NACA exchanger. So Na is for sodium, Ca is for calcium, and then exchanger. You can even see it abbreviated NCX in a lot of articles. And the point is that is able to rapidly pump out calcium. If a cell is deficient in potassium, has excessive sodium, then it depletes that sodium gradient, and then it's less able to provide energy for pumping out of calcium. So the arterioles will be excessively chronically contracted, raising blood pressure. And so that's really important to know, and you'll have excessive metabolic activity and firing of the postsynaptic neuron in your hippocampus. So the same thing that causes brain damage increases your risk of brain cell damage. Okay, hypertension is a symptom of abnormally high sodium, abnormally low potassium and magnesium, as well as some of these other things. But that's kind of what I'm getting at is, it's not just a little hypertension. It's also a risk for brain damage. Let's see. Well, that was kind of one of the points I'm trying to make, is to give you a sense of these problems are not just a disease by themselves. They are manifestations of dysfunction at the cellular level. So hypertension is a manifestation, a symptom of problems with sodium, potassium, and magnesium and calcium at the cellular level. And so when somebody's hypertensive, they don't just have a problem with their arteries and high blood pressure. They have a problem with all the cells in their body, including a big problem with their brain cells. When somebody's hyperglycemic, that doesn't just mean they've got high glucose in the blood. It means they have insulin resistance, which is connected to numerous diseases throughout their body. It means they have mitochondrial dysfunction, not just in their skeletal muscle cells, but in numerous cells throughout their body, as we kind of talked about. Atherosclerosis is sort of a manifestation of hypertension and blood viscosity. They go together. Autoimmune disease, especially, is a manifestation of leaky gut. So what I'm trying to say is the way you prevent a disease is you read about it, you learn what the cause is, and then you avoid that cause. And almost all of the major diseases, you can learn the cause and you could avoid it. So that's great news. You have to make the effort to learn about these diseases, but the great news is they're almost all totally preventable. Okay, and cancer, you can't completely prevent it, but you can dramatically lower the risk of it. In some of these countries, like you look at these blue zone countries, you know, prostate cancer, you talk to some old guy, you won't even know what it is. It's so rare. Okay. Let's see. Magnesium. Magnesium is a fascinating subject. We don't got enough time to go through magnesium in detail, but it's your friend. And the way you think about magnesium, if you look at a chlorophyll molecule, chlorophyll in plants for photosynthesis, right in the center of chlorophyll is where magnesium is. It sits right in the center of it. So what I'm saying is when you eat the plants, that's where magnesium, it's sitting right in the center of chlorophyll. That's another reason to eat your salads. Okay, chlorophyll, magnesium blocks, it's right sitting inside the receptor on the posthippocampal neuron, and it blocks what's called the NMDA receptor. That's the big receptor for glutamate, the excitatory neurotransmitter. So it protects your postsynaptic neuron from excessive stimulation from numerous things, MSG, cortisol, stress, caffeine, sleep deprivation, etc. It protects your neuron. Magnesium is your friend. And what are people usually deficient in? They're deficient in potassium, they're deficient in magnesium, and they're deficient in fiber because they don't eat plants. Okay? So you just eat the plants and you get the good stuff. When you switch from a meat-based diet, you not only avoid all the toxins and problems related with meat, and then you start eating the plants, you get all the benefits of the good stuff in the plants. Okay, so it's a great deal. It's about as good a deal of anything you'll ever get in your whole life. Okay, nutrient labels. I'll just say a few things about this. One of the fastest ways you can tell if a food's good or bad is just look at the ratio of sodium to potassium. When you look at a sweet potato, the potassium is 337, sodium is 335, 10 to 1. That's typical. You just look at that potassium-sodium ratio, and it's usually instantly obvious if a food's good or bad. Let's take a look at blueberries. Potassium, 100, sodium, 0. Sounds good. Plant foods will typically have these very high potassium to sodium ratios. They're your friend. That's what we're designed to eat. These things dilate our arteries. Open arteries are the key to life. What keeps your brain alive and functioning is open arteries, good blood supply, and everything else was good then, good nutrient supply. Vasoconstriction, excessive sodium, that's what you worry about. Big blobs of thick blood from rouleau formation due to fat sticking everything together. That's what gets you in trouble. Okay, here's just a random generic cereal. I don't even have the name of it on here. But the point I want to make is this is very typical of a breakfast cereal. 330 milligrams of sodium, 0 potassium. That's not a misprint, okay? And don't get me wrong, a lot of them will have less. They'll have about 200, 250, but they're still dramatically high levels of sodium and routinely present in cereals, breakfast cereals. This is why I quit eating cereals, because even the organic ones will tend to have high sodiums, and they'll very often have MSG added to them. I don't want MSG in my food. And MSG will be hidden under a bunch of different names like extracts, natural flavors. Okay, how to lose weight fast. Okay, everybody knows about this. I know Chef AJ's audience is very well informed on this subject, but the only thing I'll say to you that I think you're going to find interesting is you look at these populations eating something like a rice diet. You know, 1 billion out of 1 billion rice eating persons are skinny. And everybody says, well, because it's low fat. And I think, yeah, that's true. But I think there might be another little secret about why are these patients so skinny. And I think part of it might be they're also eating a low protein diet. And we all know that you can be pretty healthy on a low protein diet. Of course, the great Dr. McDougall's talked about breast milk having only 5 to 6% protein, and that's the most protein you ever need at the most rapid phase of growth in your life. And subsequent to that, we need less. And the World Health Organization and other places have checked. If you want to feed poor people and keep them alive and healthy, you only need to give them about 3% protein, and you can't have too little protein unless you're starving. All of that's wonderful. But here's the point I'm making. When you lower dietary protein, your body can only burn glucose or fat. You are now giving your liver an extra job because there's a relative lack of protein supply, amino acids. It now has to burn more fat, which makes you skinny. You get it? Because you can take a triglyceride, the main form of dietary fat, and you can take the glycerol is a 3-carbon, like a propane skeleton, to which 3 fatty acids are attached, okay? That's a triglyceride. I also call it a triacyl glyceride. So the point I'm saying is it's going to have to burn more of those glycerols to make glucose. And because of that, you're going to lose weight. And it's been thought too, I read some paper about it suggesting that even some of the fatty acids themselves get sent to brown fat to be burned as heat. That happens more often. So all I'm saying is that's something I think that's happening with weight loss that a lot of people don't know about. Oh, I'll tell you guys one quick funny story. I wanted to become skinnier. I want to try to look a little bit more like Neil Bernard was what I was going to try to do. And so I said, my weight was pretty good. If you look at my videos, my Peter Rogers MD YouTube, you'll see that I was a little fatter. I thought I was pretty healthy. I was lifting a lot of weights. I like lifting weights, doing squats and other pretty heavy weightlifting. It's a hobby of mine for fun. I enjoy doing it. But anyways, why am I mentioning this? So I went on an OMAD diet, 1 meal a day diet, and 100% plant-based, like all the same. But I was only eating dinner. That's it on a work day. On a day off, I'll eat a little lunch or something just for something to do. But the point I'm saying is I lost a lot of weight. I lost 30 pounds from 188 down to 158. And I think this maybe contributes a little bit to it. I like the OMAD diet. The reason was I saved about an hour and a half, 2 hours a day because I didn't have to prepare and deal with the consequences of breakfast and lunch. And my energy felt fine. I had gotten the idea because I read about the Roman soldiers. They would just work all day long, eat a giant dinner, and go to sleep when there's no electric lights in those days. Plus, I read, nice paper, Gerald Shulman. He's a Yale expert on insulin resistance, that it's pretty easy for the liver to maintain blood glucose levels for 24 hours. It can do it for 48 hours pretty easily before people start going into ketosis. So I figured 24 hours, no big deal. Okay. And plus I had many times, like I'll often on a Saturday morning read a really complicated papers, scientific papers and whatnot, and books. And I noticed that as soon as I eat lunch, I become stupid. I become tired. I got to take a nap. I think you start switching into a PANS, parasympathetic autonomic nervous system phase. And so what I'm trying to say is I kept pushing lunch back farther and farther because I wanted to maintain my ability to concentrate on complex things. And pretty soon I said, I might as well just push it back to dinner. So anyways, I have done the OMAD diet, 1 meal a day diet since June, and I liked it. Now, you don't have to do it, but I've liked it for the convenience. I like having that extra hour and a half of time. I can sleep more. I got a little more time for whatever I want to do in the evenings, for what that's worth. And my family, of course, Voltaire said something. He said, if you write, there's only 2 things you can expect to happen. He says, jealousy if you're successful, contempt if you're not. And it's kind of like, you'll say, well, what does my family say to me? My family tells me I look too skinny. They nickname me, they call me Mr. Bones. My son puts his hands on my shoulders. He's in his 20s, like a weightlifter. Young guys lift weights. He's like, Dad, you're so skinny. It's pathetic. He says, you look at your little tiny shoulders, your neck. You look like a woman. You look at my girlfriend. And I'm like, look, pal, at my age in your 50s, it is high status to be skinny. Almost everybody's fat after 50. So being skinny after 50 is high status. And that's what I'm doing. I'm not a 20-year-old guy. Okay. So anyways, coronary artery disease. One thing I would tell you, if you like it, check out William C. Roberts. He's like the most famous cardiac coronary arteries pathologist in the world. He wrote a legacy paper towards his retirement, 2,000 autopsies. Here's the name of the paper: Quantitative Extent of Atherosclerosis with Major Epicardial Coronary Arteries at Necroscopy. And you could just watch his videos. He has YouTube videos at William C. Roberts, just his name, and it's almost funny. So here's this guy who's the best cardiac pathologist in the whole world, and he's written the best paper ever written on coronary artery disease. And you go watch his video. There's 12 views. I always laugh. This guy's this brilliant genius of atherosclerosis, and nobody even knows he exists. So anyways, you can watch the video at his site, and here's the point. What he said was single artery disease in a coronary is a myth. It's always diffuse. It's always of similarity in all three coronary arteries. And what this gets at is you can't win the game of coronary artery disease simply with a bypass or a stent, because the disease is always diffuse. And you might fix one narrowing. Stenosis means narrowing, but there's going to be more of them. And cardiac cath tends to underestimate the significance of the stenosis. A cardiac cath, 50% stenosis, tends to be 75% at autopsy. Because how do you gauge a stenosis? You gauge a stenosis by the adjacent segment of artery. Well, if the adjacent segment of artery is also stenotic itself, you're going to be underestimating these stenoses. And you could treat the diffuse disease, of course, with statins and other anti-hyperlipidemic medications. But the point I'm making is coronary artery disease is a diffuse problem. Okay, I'm seeing, did I miss anything? One thing I'll tell you about too, I'll tell you about this one guy, Gregory Sloop. Gregory Sloop, I think, is the best researcher in the world for atherosclerosis. There's a lot of really good ones, but he's a big proponent of what is called the atherothrombosis theory. I've been studying atherosclerosis in some detail for, 25 years, okay? And I can tell you, I've read pretty much everything I can get my hands on in atherosclerosis. Sloop's theory of atherothrombosis and his explanation of the mechanism, I think they're about the best. I had his book in here somewhere. I found the book. Here's the book. And I'll show you another great book. Two great books I got to show you. So here is Sloop. What is it called here? Blood viscosity and its role in cardiovascular pathophysiology and hematology. Brilliant book. If you want to understand atherosclerosis, and I can tell you hardly anybody knows it. Hardly anybody. I would go around trying to talk to everybody about atherosclerosis, all the so-called experts. Nobody knew enough to have a conversation with me, okay? Here is Delatorre's book, Alzheimer's Turning Point. Great book. This is the guy I told you about doing all the mice research and coming up with the concept of mouse equivalents. Brilliant. Okay. I think that's the best way to look at dementia. The reason is when you look at the vascular component of dementia, you can do tremendous things to diminish your risk. Okay. If I tell you reduce your beta amyloid cascade hypothesis component of risk in Alzheimer's, you don't know what to do. There actually is something you could do, but it's complicated and it's not as powerful as all this vascular stuff. So anyways, Sloop is great if you want to understand atherosclerosis. All right. And also, by the way, I look at CT angiograms every day. I spend a lot of my time doing that. Atherothrombosis explains the findings much better than isolated cholesterol theory. Cholesterol theory is a subset of atherothrombosis. In addition, you're going to hear about other theories, vasovasorum theory, okay, protective adaptation theory, inflammation theory of atherosclerosis. They all are subsets of atherothrombosis theory. So as a matter of fact, maybe I'll say one or two things that are a little interesting about that. And by the way, William C. Roberts also agrees with atherothrombosis theories. The two pathologists, Sloop is a pathologist. They're the guys that actually look under a microscope at atherosclerotic plaques, and they both think it is primarily due to formation of a blood clot with subsequent lamination and organization of a thrombus. That's why it'll trend into becoming fibrous tissue and becoming calcified. And if you look at hematomas elsewhere in the body, over time they become fibrous tissue and they calcify. That's what happens to hematomas. So it's rather fascinating. Doesn't change what you should do. Become a vegan and low salt vegan, low fat vegan. Okay. But it's kind of interesting. Let's see. People get stented and they're like, oh, I got it fixed. I'm glad I got my heart fixed. No, your heart's not fixed. I mean, that helps that you got stented. Okay. Let's say for that blockage, but that doesn't decrease your risk of all cause mortality. You still have diffuse coronary artery atherosclerosis. You have to, lower your cholesterol, etc. All right. And also, by the way, I don't know if I already said this. My total cholesterol is 93. My LDL is 53. That's super low, by the way. The average American's I think it's about 227 is their average total cholesterol. And you want to be at least below 150. That's sort of the threshold. Like Caldwell Esselstyn at the Cleveland Clinic, the prevent and reverse heart disease expert, he kept all his patients, told them to keep their total cholesterol below 150. So that's good to know. It works. Okay. It works in a big way. I don't take any pills. All right. Let's see what else. What I'm trying to say is the smart thing to do to win the game of health is have optimal health habits to the best you can and keep learning about them and avoid all these problems. I don't go for a checkup. Why would I go for a checkup? My risk of anything is so low that if your risk is really low, then you're much higher likely going to find false positives. You don't want false positives. So you look at these people in the blue zones, for example, they didn't go to a doctor, these centenarians, until maybe 5 years before their death. All right. If you keep your pretest probability low, you don't need to go looking for stuff. And it's kind of nice. And like I said, I think the biggest relief is if you don't know anything about health and you have bad health habits, you keep on having medical problems and you don't know where they're coming from. And it's very scary. On the other hand, if you understand these simple things, eat the best diet, avoid estrogenic chemicals, avoid other toxic chemicals, then you're probably going to be healthy and not have any problems, and you don't need to worry about stuff. Okay. Coronary artery disease. Well, we don't got that much more time to talk about it, but one thing I'll just tell you is how can you detect BS? Okay. One of the things you're going to hear, oh, well, the main cause of a myocardial infarction is rupture of a vulnerable plaque. Yeah, right. Is that why coronary artery cardiologist goes into the coronary and starts wiggling wires around and balloons and stents, rupturing a million plaques? I mean, that's an exaggeration, of course, but what I'm trying to say is vulnerable plaque cannot explain that much about atherosclerosis. It's overrated. Okay. There's a lot more to atherosclerosis than that. I just tell you that because use your common sense. Like another thing you'll hear is, what about the bacterial theory of atherosclerosis? Numerous different bacteria have been isolated from atherosclerotic plaque. Do you think they're contributing? I don't think so. I think they're functioning like saprophytes, just trying to clean up the mess. And the reason I say that is, look at Esselstyn. Put the patients on a vegan diet and he got like 100% resolution of problems, no recurrent coronary events, other than the one we talked about. He didn't follow the diet. The point being is, he didn't need antibiotics to help those patients. All right. And it's not the same bacteria. Okay. So that's the bacteria theory. Let's see. Covered a lot of this stuff. Haverid's vasovasorum theory, that's a minor contribution. It's interesting. If we had more time, I could talk more about atherosclerosis. I find it a fascinating subject. It's like I said, it's a very preventable disease. It's more complex than people think. I don't think a fatty streak is a progenitor to atherosclerosis. I think they're two different things, by the way. And by the way, how does atherosclerosis become subendothelial? I don't believe in this oxidized cholesterol stuff. My understanding of it from extensive study is you have endothelial precursor cells, endothelial stem cells that simply cover up the atherothrombosis, the clot, and that's how it becomes subendothelial, the LDL connected to the RBC. The LDL is connected to the RBC and almost always present because it's what sticks the red blood cells together and makes them clot. So that's pretty interesting. And that's why you can get an atherosclerotic plaque within a dialysis graft where there is no endothelium, because it's the blood flowing endothelial precursor cells, stem cells that do it. That's why also in a transplant patient, you can get these stem cells that are coming from the person's body that are different than the transplant itself with a coronary artery atherosclerotic plaque. I've got some good stuff on stress. How much time do I got left, AJ? I think you're muted. You're still muted, I believe, AJ. I think you're still muted. I see the mute sign over you.
What I was saying is I apologize, Dr. Rogers, but I do have to teach today.
Okay.
I do need a small break before my class, and we would love to have you back where you could finish the presentation and maybe even do a Q&A because there are lots of questions.
Oh, I would love to. Okay, so you want me to call it now?
Yeah, well, just maybe there's just a couple questions if you could possibly answer
sure.
Ones quickly. If you so one of them is alcohol. I'm guessing that's an A.
I would recommend 0 alcohol. And the reason I say that is alcohol is a tumor promoter. The last thing in the world I want to do is pour a tumor promoter over my mouth. The cancers of the mouth and the throat, they're terrible cancers. I'm a neuroradiologist. I look at them all the time. They're awful. They got to do really major surgeries, radiation and stuff. You don't want that. And they're easy to prevent. And atherosclerosis, I'm not such a big believer in this cardioprotective effect. Certainly after a couple of drinks, it starts becoming quite atherogenic, and it's largely converted to saturated fat in the liver. When I look at fatty livers, and I've seen tons, thousands of fatty livers, the alcohol, well, that's especially with alcoholics, it produces a much more intense fatty liver typically than just the high-fat diet. But I think alcohol is a good thing to avoid. It damages a lot of things. Plus, there's all kinds of weird little problems with alcohol, which you might not think of at first. For example, look at a grape. It has such a thin outer membrane, and those things are sprayed quite heavily with pesticide. How is the grape going to keep the pesticides out? How are you going to clean a grape? Okay, I think it's a bad idea in drinking alcohol. I drink zero alcohol. Plus, I'm all about drinking, being smart as possible. Like if Dr. McDougall likes to be called Dr. Potato, if I had to be called anything, it'd probably be Dr. IQ by the people who know me. Okay, I spent a tremendous amount of time studying cognitive optimization. How does one, optimize cognitive function? Because I went through a really sort of intense academic background with, trying to become successful academically at Stanford, and also my experience subsequent to that, like in medical school. So I pretty much read everything I possibly could for many, many years about optimizing academic performance and cognitive performance, and also about preventing dementia. I'm a neuroradiologist. One of the most common things I do is I look at demented brains all day, and they scare me, and I don't want that to happen to myself. And so I read everything about it. I try to help my patients too. A lot of times with patients, though, it's hard to get people to buy into this stuff. You can't just get a 1 + 1 = 2 answer. You have to spend some time thinking about it, and it takes time.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, because they always say in the blue zones, they drink alcohol.
Yeah, well, I think there's a tendency to exaggerate things. And what I mean by that is there's nothing good about alcohol. And also sometimes a person, can be so good in other areas, they're able to compensate for a fault. But I'm not aware of anything, zero good coming from alcohol. And like I said, I think the cardioprotective effect is exaggerated.
I love that. I'm not aware of anything good coming from alcohol. Time for one more question. Everybody's wondering what you eat for your one meal a day.
Well, for example, I'll often have beans. Beans, because of their large amount of fiber, have a very prolonged satiety. Let's see, what else? I like to eat blueberries. Blueberries, they taste good and they're very nutritious. Like we said, tons of potassium, zero sodium. They got a lot of antioxidants. I always have a salad. I think there's tons of healthy chemicals in salads, like the magnesium, for example, and all these other phytonutrients that I don't even know what they are, but they're just what our bodies are designed to eat. You look back at, for example, I read a fascinating biography of Dennis Burkitt, and he believed we should be eating 100 to 150 grams a day of fiber. Typical Americans only eating about 12. And so what I'm trying to say is you want to get increased fiber intake. Let's see, what else do I eat? I like eating carrots. I like eating apples. If there's vegetables available, I'll eat them, but that's pretty rare, like, broccoli or cauliflower, but I like them. One of my favorite foods would probably be sweet potatoes and potatoes. I eat a lot of those. I'll eat rice still, but, I'm a little concerned about the arsenic issue. So what do? I'll eat, white rice from an area like California, for example, that's organic. And I've checked the website that there's relatively low arsenic contamination. I'll rinse it a couple times first, then I'll cook it in extra water, reverse osmosis, again, all to lower that. And, how significant is the arsenic? I don't know, but I certainly want to minimize it. I do think that there is some problem, like I'm familiar with the whole chicken fertilizer problem, whereby the chicken farmers sold the rice poop to the rice farmers to use as fertilizer, and then it got into the soil, and it takes decades to get it out of there. So anyways, what else do I like to eat? I'll eat oatmeal occasionally, but I like it sometimes in the winter. I'll probably eat a little more rice and oatmeal because they're hot foods. They warm me up a little bit. Oatmeal is a little higher in the fat, though. It's about, it's one of the higher fat levels for starches. So that's one of the reasons if I was trying to lose weight, I'd reduce my oatmeal a little bit, but I still think oatmeal is a great food. Quinoa, I'll eat it occasionally. Quinoa is a little higher in protein, a little lower in fat compared to oatmeal. What else do I like? I like a variety of beans. I like garbanzos. I like lentils, all the different types of lentils. I like black beans too. I mean, I like peas. I do think I think McDougall's probably right though, compared to some of these younger guys when he says you don't need that much variety, because there's a little bit of a debate. If you listen to, William Bolshevitz, he's the guy who wrote the Fiber Fueled book, which I think was an excellent book. I think he's a very bright guy, but he kind of pushes the idea that also comes, I think, from one of these California researchers about you should eat as many plant foods as possible to have as healthy and diverse a microbiome in your colon as possible. And I think, yeah, there's some wisdom to that, but I don't think you need to eat that many things. And the reason I say that is look at the epidemiology. A lot of these populations are all relatively poor and rural. They don't eat that many foods. And so when some people say if you eat more variety, you're more likely to gain weight. But I simply think that if you feel good and you're healthy, you eat a decent variety, that's enough. I don't think there's that big a need to seek out such a variety. Somebody might say I'm wrong on that, but there seems to be good epidemiological data to say you don't need to be seeking out variety that much. So that's about it.
Great. Well, thank you so much. This was a wonderful presentation, and we'd love to have you back sometime.
Oh, I would love to. Thank you very much for having me on the show.
Absolutely. Thanks all of you for watching another episode of Chef AJ Live. Please come back tomorrow when my guest is